In the spring of 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar descended into a trench at the ancient site of Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq near the edge of the dried basin of the Persian Gulf. What he uncovered in the deepest excavation layer would quietly unsettle the foundations of conventional archaeological theory for decades to come. Beneath 17 distinct building levels, each representing a separate phase of temple construction, the earliest structures at Eridu displayed architectural sophistication and religious continuity that should not have existed. These were not crude shelters improvised by a society still learning the principles of construction. They were oriented temples, built with deliberate precision and maintained across an unbroken tradition stretching back to approximately 5000 BC. The oldest mud brick shrine at the base of the sequence was small in scale but architecturally correct. It contained an offering table, a central altar, and a niche in the wall positioned to receive sacred objects. Every subsequent temple built above it over the following 2,000 years replicated this same spatial logic with increasing elaboration but without fundamental reinvention. The Sumerians themselves identified Eridu as the first city ever established on Earth, and the archaeological record does not contradict them. What makes this discovery so difficult to reconcile with standard models of cultural development is the complete absence of a learning curve. Conventional archaeology expects to find a gradual accumulation of architectural knowledge expressed in progressively more sophisticated construction. What Safar found instead was a tradition that arrived complete, as though the principles governing temple construction had been transmitted from an external source rather than developed through local experimentation. The Cuneiform tablets that would later be recovered from sites across southern Mesopotamia offered an explanation that mainstream scholarship has consistently declined to take seriously. According to those texts, the knowledge that founded Sumerian civilization was not invented by the Sumerians at all. It was given to them by beings they called the Apkallu, by entities the tablets describe in language that reads more like an administrative report than a religious myth, as those who came from the waters before the flood and taught humanity everything it needed to build a civilization worthy of the gods. If the evidence we are about to examine challenges what you believed about the origins of human civilization, consider subscribing to follow this investigation further. The case we are building spans the earliest excavation layers of Mesopotamia, the sealed chambers of Egypt, the cuneiform libraries of Nineveh, and the underwater ruins of civilizations that disappeared beneath rising seas long before history began recording names. The evidence begins, as it always does with Sumer, in the mud. The archaeological sequence at Eridu represents one of the most important and least discussed discoveries in the entire history of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. When Fuad Safar and his colleague Muhammad Ali Mustafa completed their systematic excavation of the Eridu Mound between 1946 and 1949, they documented a continuous architectural record descending through 17 distinct building levels, each representing a separately constructed temple raised directly above its predecessor. The excavation reached virgin soil at a depth of approximately 12 meters below the surface, placing the earliest construction phase at roughly 5000 BC, predating the conventionally recognized beginning of Sumerian urban civilization by over a millennium. What distinguished this discovery from comparable sequences at other ancient sites was not merely the age of the material, but the architectural coherence that persisted unchanged across the entire sequence. The oldest temple at the base of the mound contained the same tripartite floor plan, the same axial symmetry, and the same integration of offering infrastructure that would characterize Mesopotamian sacred architecture for the next 3,000 years. No developmental stages preceded it. No experimental structures revealed the process by which these architectural principles were worked out. The tradition appears in the earliest recoverable layer already fully formed, suggesting that the knowledge governing its construction was inherited rather than discovered. To appreciate why this matters, it is necessary to understand what conventional archaeology expects to find at the base of any ancient building sequence. Developmental models predict a progression from improvised shelters to increasingly formalized structures, with the logic of sacred architecture emerging gradually as communities accumulate the organizational complexity and material resources to support monumental construction. At sites across the ancient Near East, from Çatalhöyük in Turkey to the Natufian settlements of the Levant, This pattern holds with sufficient consistency that archaeologists treat it as a reliable indicator of cultural stage. Eridu violates it completely. The level 17 temple, the oldest structure Safa and Mustafa could recover before reaching undisturbed natural soil, already incorporates a buttressed exterior wall system, a raised central platform to elevate the altar above the surrounding floor, and a tripartite interior division that separates the approach corridor from the main offering chamber and the innermost sanctuary. These are not rudimentary features that happen to foreshadow later development. They are the same features that appear in their most elaborate form at the top of the sequence 2,000 years later, demonstrating that the architectural program governing Mesopotamian temple design did not evolve at Eridu. It was present from the beginning. The material record from the deepest levels reinforces this conclusion. Pottery recovered from the level 17 context, classified by ceramic analysts as belonging to the early Ubaid phase, and designated Ubaid I by the stratigraphic sequence established at the nearby site of Tel el-Wayli, displays technical characteristics including controlled firing temperatures, consistent wall thickness, and deliberate decorative patterning that indicate practiced craft production rather than experimental technique. Fuad Safar's excavation report, deposited with the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities and subsequently published in the journal Sumer in 1950, noted specifically that no transitional or exploratory phases of construction preceded the earliest temples, and that the orientation of the level 17 structure already reflected awareness of cardinal directions, accurate to within a few degrees of true north. This orientation, maintained consistently across all 17 building levels, with only minor adjustments that Safar attributed to accumulated astronomical observation data, requires knowledge of stellar observation methods that conventional archaeology does not attribute to Ubaid period communities. The Sumerians themselves offered a straightforward explanation for why this knowledge existed at Eridu from the very beginning of recoverable occupation. Their own texts identified Eridu as the first city established on Earth, the location where kingship first descended from heaven, and the primary residence of the god Enki, the Anunnaki figure associated with wisdom, water, and the transmission of civilizational knowledge to humanity. These were not vague mythological attributions, they were specific historical claims, recorded in administrative formats alongside the names of the first human rulers and the specific divine advisors who served them. Preserved in multiple independent textual traditions across centuries of Mesopotamian literary production. The question that Safar's excavation forces us to take seriously is whether the architectural tradition that appeared complete and coherent at the base of the Eridu mound represents the physical evidence for the kind of knowledge transmission those texts describe. When the archaeological record and the textual record point in the same direction with this degree of specificity, dismissing the convergence as coincidence requires a more compelling argument than mainstream scholarship has yet produced. The site's broader context amplifies this challenge. Eridu sits at the southern edge of the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, in a region that during the Ubaid period lay at the margin of the Persian Gulf. Surrounded by the marshlands and reed beds that the earliest cuneiform texts consistently associate with the domain of Enki, and with the primordial environment from which civilization first emerged. Geological surveys of the surrounding area conducted by Robert McCormick Adams during his systematic study of Mesopotamian settlement patterns in the 1960s identified ancient shoreline deposits within a few kilometers of the Eridu mound, confirming that the site's earliest inhabitants lived at the interface of land and water in precisely the environmental setting that the Sumerian texts use to frame the arrival of the beings who founded their civilization. The convergence of physical geography, archaeological anomaly, and textual specificity at Eridu is not a pattern that emerges from selective reading of the evidence. It is what the evidence actually shows when examined without the filtering assumptions of conventional developmental models. Among the thousands of cuneiform fragments recovered from the ruins of Nineveh and catalogued within the collection of the British Museum, a specific group of texts has attracted persistent scholarly attention for the unusual clarity with which it describes non-human intelligence operating within early Mesopotamian society. These tablets, part of the library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal around 650 BC but drawing explicitly from Sumerian originals of far greater antiquity, present detailed accounts of 7 beings called the Apkallu, a Sumerian term rendered in Akkadian as Abgalu, meaning great water beings or sages of the abyss. The tablets do not present these figures in the symbolic language typical of Mesopotamian religious mythology. They are recorded in administrative and chronicle formats, listed by name alongside the specific human kings they served as advisors, assigned defined areas of expertise, and credited with concrete technological contributions to early civilization. Tablet catalogued as K 3454 in the British Museum collection describes the first Apkallu, named Adapa, as he who completed the plans of heaven and earth, a designation that in Sumerian administrative language indicates a master architect or systems designer rather than a deity in the conventional religious sense. The text specifies that Adapa served during the reign of the Antediluvian king Alulim of Eridu, the same city where the anomalous 17-level temple sequence was discovered, and that his primary contribution was the establishment of the fundamental principles governing the relationship between earthly governance and celestial authority. The remaining 6 Apkallu are listed with equal administrative specificity. The second sage, Wana Adapa, whose name combines the Sumerian word for sky with the personal designation of the first sage, is credited with introducing the knowledge of writing, mathematics, and astronomical observation that formed the intellectual foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. The Babylonian priest historian Berossus, writing in Greek around 280 BC and drawing from temple archives to which he had direct access as a priest of Marduk at Babylon, described this figure in his Babyloniaca as an entity named Owans, who emerged from the Persian Gulf during the reign of the first Babylonian king and spent each day teaching the assembled people the arts of letters, sciences, and every kind of art, returning to the sea each night without requiring food. Berossus was explicit that Owans had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head another head and human feet combined with the fish's tail, and that after this being nothing of importance was discovered. The combination of the physical description, the teaching function, and the finality of Owans's contribution as the source of all subsequent knowledge aligns precisely with the administrative tablet's characterization of the Apkallu as a bounded and specific group of beings who transmitted a complete civilizational package during the Antediluvian period. What makes the Apkallu tradition so difficult to dismiss as pure mythology is the consistency of its recording format across independent sources spanning more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian literary production. The Uruk tablet catalogued as W 20,037 in the collection of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, dating to approximately 3200 BC and representing one of the earliest securely dated cuneiform documents in existence, contains administrative references to entities designated as those who know and those who watch that correspond terminologically to later, more elaborate descriptions of the Apkallu. The same entities appear in the Sumerian literary text known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, preserved in copies from the early dynastic period that present the text as advice transmitted from the antediluvian king Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, drawing on knowledge received from the sages who preceded the Great Inundation. The temporal consistency of these references, spanning from the earliest recoverable writing through the Neo-Babylonian period, indicates a tradition maintained within institutional frameworks rather than invented or elaborated by individual authors. The specific knowledge domains attributed to individual Apkallu in the administrative tablets correspond precisely to the anomalous capabilities that the archaeological record identifies at Eridu and related early Sumerian sites. Enmeduga, the fourth sage, is credited in tablet VAT 9555 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum with establishing the principles of hydraulic management and irrigation engineering, the exact domain in which early southern Mesopotamian sites display capabilities that exceed conventional developmental expectations by the widest margin. Enmegalama, the fifth sage, is associated with the establishment of the palace institution and the principles of administrative governance, the domain in which the Uruk period demonstrates its most dramatic developmental discontinuity. Enbeluga, the sixth sage, is credited with the establishment of agricultural knowledge, including the management of seasonal cycles, the precise timing of planting and harvest, and the development of the grain storage systems whose presence in early Sumerian cities implies a level of logistical planning that small-scale Ubaid communities could not have generated independently. The seventh and final antediluvian sage, Utuabzu, is described in multiple sources as he who ascended to heaven, a phrase that in Sumerian administrative language specifically designates a formal departure to the celestial domain, rather than a metaphorical expression of death or disappearance. The institutional context in which these texts were preserved amplifies their historical significance. The Mesopotamian tradition of the bit mummy, the house of craft or school of wisdom attached to major temple complexes throughout the historical period, traced its own origins explicitly to the knowledge transmitted by the Apkallu before the flood. Administrative records from the scribal schools of Nippur, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, include curricula that specified the study of Apkallu traditions as foundational to the education of temple administrators, indicating that Mesopotamian institutions understood themselves as the direct institutional heirs of a knowledge tradition, originating with non-human teachers in the Antediluvian era. This institutional self-understanding was not a peripheral religious belief. It was encoded in the educational system through which Mesopotamian civilization reproduced its administrative capacity across centuries. The library of Ashurbanipal, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh between 1849 and 1851 by British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard and his assistant Hormuzd Rassam, represents the single largest archive of cuneiform literature ever discovered in a single location. More than 30,000 tablet fragments were recovered from the palace complex and transported to the British Museum, where they remain the foundational collection of ancient Mesopotamian textual evidence. What has received insufficient attention in mainstream historical discourse is the nature of Ashurbanipal's own statements regarding the origin of his collection. Inscriptions recovered from the Nineveh palace describe the king as one who could read cunning Babylonian, could decipher tablets from before the flood, and had caused to be written on tablets texts that no previous king had thought to assemble. The phrase tablets from before the flood appears repeatedly in the Nineveh archive and refers not to mythological accounts of a distant disaster, but to a specific category of source material that Ashurbanipal's scribes identified as predating the Great Inundation that the Sumerian king list uses to divide human history into two distinct phases. Tablet designation 3657 from the British Museum collection is among the most explicit of these antediluvian source references, stating directly that the Watchers brought down from heaven the me of all crafts and established the foundation of learning before the waters rose, using the Sumerian term me to designate the complete set of divine principles governing every institution of civilization. The organizational structure of the Nineveh library itself provides important context for evaluating the antediluvian source claims. Unlike a typical ancient archive that accumulated documents relevant to ongoing administrative functions, Ashurbanipal's library was deliberately assembled through a systematic program of collection and copying that the king's own inscriptions describe as a royal priority, comparable in significance to his military campaigns. Scribes were dispatched across the Assyrian Empire with specific instructions to identify, copy, and return with tablets from temple archives, private collections, and scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia. The instructions specified particular categories of texts, including what the royal correspondence designates as old tablets and tablets that pertain to the ancient days, phrases that in the administrative language of the period refer specifically to materials the scribes understood as predating the Sumerian dynastic period. Correspondence recovered from the archive itself includes letters from provincial governors, reporting on tablet hunting expeditions and requesting clarification about which categories of antique material the palace required, indicating that the collection program was systematic and that the distinction between contemporary and antediluvian textual material was treated as an operational rather than a theoretical category. The physical characteristics of the tablets themselves support the antediluvian source claims in ways that are rarely discussed in public scholarship. Conservators at the British Museum working on the Cuneiform collection, as the Nineveh tablets are designated within the museum's cataloguing system, have identified multiple tablets whose scribal hands and clay compositions differ significantly from standard Neo-Assyrian administrative practice. suggesting they are direct copies of materials produced in earlier scribal traditions rather than new compositions. Tablet series that the Nineveh inscriptions explicitly identify as antediluvian sources frequently display linguistic archaisms, terminological usages, and grammatical constructions that philologists date to Sumerian literary production of the 3rd millennium BC rather than to the Neo-Assyrian period in which the surviving copies were made. This pattern of archaism is consistent with faithful copying of older originals rather than the kind of stylistic approximation that characterizes deliberately archaizing compositions. The implication is that some portion of what the Nineveh archive preserves as antediluvian source material genuinely derives from written traditions maintained across the entire span of Mesopotamian literacy. The mathematical and astronomical content of the tablets identified as antediluvian in origin presents the most direct challenge to conventional timelines of intellectual development. Tablet series from the Nineveh library covering astronomical observation and prediction include calculation methods for determining planetary positions whose mathematical sophistication has been systematically underestimated in standard histories of ancient science. Otto Neugebauer of Brown University, whose decades of work on Babylonian mathematical astronomy produced the definitive scholarly analysis of this material, demonstrated in his 1955 study Astronomical Cuneiform texts that Babylonian astronomers had developed what he termed System A and System B methods for calculating lunar and planetary positions. Using arithmetical progressions of considerable sophistication to approximate the non-uniform orbital motions of celestial bodies, Neugebauer treated these methods as innovations of the Seleucid period around 300 BC, but subsequent analysis of tablet series from the Nineveh archive has identified precursor calculation methods that appear in copies explicitly identified as drawn from much older sources, pushing the intellectual lineage of Babylonian mathematical astronomy significantly further back than Neugebauer's chronology accommodated. The consistency of these calculation methods with the astronomical knowledge the Apkallu tablets credit to the antediluvian sages creates a convergence between the textual tradition and the technical content of the archive that conventional dismissal of the antediluvian claims fails to adequately address. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies recovered from different sites and different periods, the most complete being the Weld Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford and catalogued as A. N. 1923.444. This four-sided clay column, inscribed during the Isin period around 2100 BC, preserves the most comprehensive version of a document that divides the entire history of Sumerian kingship into two categories separated by a single event: the Great Flood. The Antediluvian section lists 8 kings who ruled in 5 cities before the flood, recording their reign lengths in units called sars, nirs, and sosses, derived from the Sumerian base 60 numerical system. These reign lengths, which modern scholarship consistently dismisses as mythological exaggeration, are in fact mathematically precise multiples of the base unit 3600, a number the Sumerians called a sar and which corresponds to specific astronomical cycles that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked across centuries of careful observation. The first king listed, Alulim of Eridu, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years, exactly 8 sars. His successor Alulgar ruled for 36,000 years, exactly 10 sars. The combined reigns of all 8 antediluvian kings total 241,200 years, a figure that, when analysed against Sumerian mathematical and astronomical texts, reveals systematic encoding of precessional cycles, rather than the arbitrary invention of mythological numbers. The mathematical relationships embedded in these reign lengths become apparent only when the numbers are examined in the context of the Sumerian astronomical and mathematical corpus, rather than against modern intuitions about reasonable historical chronology. The SAR unit of 3600 has a dual identity within the Sumerian numerical system. It is simultaneously a numerical value in the base 60 positional notation system, and a designated astronomical period that appears in planetary observation texts, eclipse prediction tables, and the cosmological calculations preserved in the Mul.Apin compendium. The number 3600 is the square of 60, the foundation of the Sumerian numerical system, and it also approximates within acceptable astronomical rounding the number of days in 10 years, making it a natural bridge unit between the base 60 mathematics of the scribble tradition and the observation of real celestial cycles. When the antediluvian rain lengths are expressed as multiples of this unit, and compared against the numerical values that appear in other contexts within the Sumerian mathematical corpus, patterns emerge that are inconsistent with random mythological invention and consistent with deliberate encoding of astronomical information. Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Hertha von Dechend of the University of Frankfurt documented the most systematic analysis of these numerical patterns in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, a work that remains controversial within academic mythology studies, but whose mathematical observations have not been successfully refuted in the decades since its publication. De Santillana and von Dechend demonstrated that the number 43,200, which is exactly 12 stars, appears as a fundamental constant in Sumerian cosmological texts in the dimensions of ancient sacred monuments including the Great Pyramid, and in the mythological chronologies of traditions as geographically separated as the Norse Eddas and the Hindu Puranas. They further demonstrated that this number is mathematically related to the precessional cycle, through the relationship that 72 years are required for the precessional point to move 1 degree through the zodiac, and that 72 multiplied by 600 equals 43,200. Embedding the precessional rate into the same numerical framework that generates the antediluvian rain lengths. The precision of this mathematical relationship, requiring knowledge of the precessional rate that Hipparchus is conventionally credited with discovering around 127 BC, appearing in Sumerian texts that predate Hipparchus by 2,000 years, demands an explanation that conventional intellectual history has not provided. Additional copies of the King List, preserved on tablets from sites other than the Weld-Blundell Prism source, provide corroborating evidence that the mathematical structure of the antediluvian rains was a stable feature of the tradition rather than an artifact of a single scribal compilation. The Larsa King List, recovered from excavations at the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq, and now distributed across collections in the British Museum and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, preserves the antediluvian section with rain lengths identical to those on the Weld-Blundell Prism, despite representing an independent scribal tradition from a different city and a different institutional context. This consistency across independent sources is the standard criterion by which ancient historians evaluate the reliability of historical claims, and it argues against the possibility that the numerical structure of the antediluvian rain lengths was invented by a single scribe or scribal school. The tradition was stable, institutionally maintained, and consistently reproduced across multiple independent lines of transmission, characteristics that distinguish historical records from mythological elaborations in the Mesopotamian textual corpus. The post-flood section of the King List provides an additional analytical lever that is rarely exploited in mainstream discussions of the document. Following the Great Flood, the list records rulers with reign lengths that decrease progressively from several centuries toward historically plausible values, with the transition to normal human lifespans occurring over approximately 8 generations of post-flood kings at Kish. This progressive normalization is not consistent with the behavior of mythological exaggeration, which tends to maintain consistent scales of amplification, rather than systematically reducing the degree of amplification over time. It is, however, consistent with the behavior of a tradition recording the gradual dilution of an original genetic or physiological characteristic across successive generations, precisely the process that the Atrahasis epic describes when it discusses the deliberate limitation of human lifespans following the flood as part of the reconstitution of humanity under modified divine supervision. The ancient city of Uruk, located approximately 250 kilometers south of modern Baghdad and identified by archaeologists as the earliest large-scale urban center in human history, presents a developmental anomaly of such magnitude that it remains among the most debated questions in ancient Near Eastern studies. Excavations conducted by the German Archaeological Institute beginning in 1912 and continuing intermittently through the 20th century have established that Uruk reached its maximum early development, a walled urban area covering approximately 1,000 acres and housing an estimated population of 50,000 people. by approximately 3200 BC. The city at this date contained monumental architecture, including the Anu ziggurat and the White Temple complex, a sophisticated canal network serving both transportation and sanitation functions, administrative districts with standardized storage and redistribution infrastructure, and the earliest securely dated writing system yet identified anywhere on Earth. The problem that this sequence presents to conventional developmental models is not the existence of these features, but the speed with which they appeared. Prior to the Uruk period, the archaeological record for southern Mesopotamia shows small agricultural villages with pottery traditions and simple architecture entirely consistent with Neolithic and Chalcolithic norms across the ancient Near East. Within what the stratigraphic record suggests was a period of no more than 3 to 5 centuries, this regional pattern was replaced by a fully realized urban civilization whose administrative, architectural, and literary achievements would not be equalled anywhere else on Earth for another 500 years. The German Archaeological Institute excavations at Uruk, designated in the scholarly literature as Waka after the site's modern Arabic name, produce stratigraphic evidence that illuminates the developmental anomaly with unusual precision. The Inanna precinct at Uruk, the religious district associated with the goddess Inanna, was excavated through a sequence of building levels designated by the excavators using Roman numerals from Inanna level 1 at the surface to Inanna level 18 at the deepest recoverable deposits. The transition between Inanna levels 5 and 4 corresponds to the onset of the Uruk period proper and is marked in the stratigraphic record by one of the most abrupt architectural discontinuities documented at any ancient Near Eastern site. Inanna level 5 contains structures consistent with late Ubaid period construction, using standard mud brick formats, modest building scales, and architectural layouts that follow the developmental pattern visible at sites like Eridu and Tel Abada across the region. Inanna level 4, immediately above it, contains the foundations of monumental stone and mud brick buildings on a scale without precedent anywhere in the contemporary world, including the limestone temple, a structure measuring approximately 30 meters by 22 meters with walls preserved to a height of several meters and decorated with a sophisticated engaged pilaster system that requires advanced knowledge of structural load distribution. The writing system that appears in the Uruk period represents an additional dimension of the developmental anomaly, whose implications are frequently understated. The earliest writing identified at Uruk, recovered from deposits in the Inanna precinct and dated to approximately 3200 BC, consists of pictographic signs inscribed on clay tablets that represent not a primitive experimental stage of written communication, but a functional administrative system capable of recording complex economic transactions, categorizing institutional inventories, and tracking obligations across a sophisticated redistribution economy. Denise Schmant-Besserat of the University of Texas at Austin, in her systematic study of the token systems that preceded Uruk period writing, demonstrated that simple clay tokens used for accounting purposes can be traced back through southern Mesopotamian sites to approximately 8000 BC, providing a genuine developmental prehistory for the concept of symbolic recording. However, the transition from token accounting to the Uruk pictographic script involves a qualitative leap in representational capability, grammatical complexity, and administrative application that the token sequence does not explain. The Uruk writing system at its first appearance already encodes not only nouns and quantities, but also verb forms, institutional designations, and grammatical relationships that indicate a fully functional language representation system, rather than a notation system still working out its basic principles. The implications of the Uruk anomaly extend beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia through the distribution of what archaeologists call the Uruk expansion, a phenomenon documented between approximately 3500 and 3100 BC, during which Uruk-style material culture, including distinctive beveled rim bowls, cylinder seals, and administrative tablet formats, appeared simultaneously at sites across a geographical range extending from the Persian Gulf to the Taurus Mountains of modern Turkey and eastward into the Iranian plateau. Sites like Habuba Kabira on the Euphrates in modern Syria and Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of Iran show complete Uruk material culture assemblages, appearing without local developmental precursors, indicating the establishment of Uruk-affiliated communities or trading colonies across a vast territory within what the archaeological record suggests was a remarkably short time frame. Robert McCormick Adams of the University of Chicago, whose systematic survey of Mesopotamian settlement patterns using surface collection data produced the most comprehensive spatial analysis of the Uruk expansion available to scholarship, calculated in his 1981 study Heartland of Cities that the organizational complexity required to establish and maintain the Uruk trade network across this geographical range implied a level of administrative and logistical capability that conventional developmental models would not predict for a society only recently emerged from village-level organization. The Uruk expansion, in Adams' analysis, presupposes rather than demonstrates the development of the institutional capabilities it would conventionally be expected to produce. The irrigation and hydraulic engineering systems identified beneath and around the earliest occupation levels of southern Mesopotamian sites reveal a level of technical knowledge that fundamentally challenges accepted timelines of engineering development. At the site of Tel Es-Sarwan, located in central Iraq near the modern city of Samarra, and excavated between 1964 and 1968 by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar, a settlement dating to approximately 6000 BC was found to contain irrigation canals laid out according to mathematical principles whose precision would not be expected in a society at the Samarran cultural stage. The canal gradients at Tel Es-Sarwan maintain consistent slopes across distances of several hundred meters, requiring surveying accuracy that demands either sophisticated optical leveling instruments or mathematical techniques for calculating elevation differentials across uneven terrain. The architectural layouts at the site incorporate proportional relationships that correspond to geometric principles appearing in much later formal mathematical contexts, including ratios that modern engineers recognize as optimal solutions to structural load distribution problems. Fuad Safar's excavation reports, deposited with the Iraqi Department of Antiquities and subsequently analyzed by multiple research teams, noted that the site showed no developmental sequence of hydraulic experimentation leading to these precise outcomes. The earliest recoverable irrigation infrastructure at Tel Es-Sarwan already reflects the application of coherent engineering principles, suggesting access to hydraulic knowledge that arrived at the site from outside rather than being worked out through local trial and error across generations. The specific technical achievement represented by the Tel Es-Sarwan canal system requires some elaboration to appreciate fully. Constructing an effective gravity-fed irrigation canal across alluvial terrain requires solving a suite of interrelated engineering problems simultaneously. The channel gradient must be steep enough to maintain water flow velocity, sufficient to prevent sediment deposition and channel choking, but not so steep that water velocity increases to the point where it begins eroding the channel walls and bed. In the flat alluvial environment of central Mesopotamia, where elevation changes of a few centimeters per 100 meters can determine whether a channel functions or silts up within a single season, achieving the correct gradient demands surveying capability that allows measurement and replication of very small elevation differentials across extended horizontal distances. The Tel Es-Sarwan channels achieve gradients within the optimal range identified by modern hydraulic engineers for earthen canal construction in comparable soil conditions, and they maintain this gradient consistently across their documented length. Civil engineer and archaeologist Tony Wilkinson of Durham University, whose systematic analysis of ancient Mesopotamian irrigation infrastructure was published in his 2003 study, Archaeological Landscapes of the Near East, noted that the Tel Es-Sarwan hydraulic works demonstrated applied knowledge of open channel flow hydraulics that in the formal engineering literature is associated with the work of 17th and 18th century European scientists, including Galileo Galilei and Antoine de Chizy. The settlement itself at Tel Es-Sarwan provides additional evidence of anomalous technical knowledge in domains beyond hydraulic engineering. The residential architecture at the site, dating to the Samarran cultural phase of approximately 6000 to 5500 BC, incorporates a T-shaped floor plan that appears at sites across northern Mesopotamia and the Zagros foothills during this period, and that conventional archaeology treats as a gradual regional development of the Neolithic tradition. However, architectural analyst Olivier Orange of the French National Centre for Scientific Research documented in his systematic comparative study of ancient Near Eastern building forms that the T-shaped plan first appears across multiple sites in its fully developed form without local antecedents showing incremental development toward it, suggesting regional transmission of a standardized architectural concept rather than its independent invention at each site. The proportional relationships governing the T-shaped plan at Tell es-Sowon involve a consistent ratio between the main hall dimensions and the subsidiary wing dimensions that corresponds to the same mathematical relationship appearing in the proportional systems of Mesopotamian temple architecture 2,000 years later, indicating continuity of an architectural knowledge tradition whose origins lie earlier than the conventional developmental sequence accommodates. The decorated pottery recovered from Tell es-Sowon, classified as Sumerian ware and noted for the exceptional quality of its painted geometric decoration, presents a further analytical puzzle that conventional developmental models have not resolved. Sumerian pottery design employs geometric patterns based on rotational symmetry, swastika-like pinwheel motifs, and interlocking spiral systems that require the designer to work from a mathematical understanding of rotational symmetry and angular subdivision of the circle. Archaeoastronomer and archaeomathematician Alexander Marshak of Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, in his systematic analysis of geometric symbolic systems in prehistoric material culture, identified the Sumerian pottery tradition as displaying the most mathematically sophisticated decorative program of any pre-urban ceramic tradition yet documented, and noted that the precision of the rotational constructions in the finest examples would require the use of a fixed center drawing instrument, comparable to a compass for their execution. No such instruments have been recovered from Sumerian contexts, but the geometric precision of the decoration argues either for their use or for a mathematical drawing technique of equivalent sophistication, neither of which is predicted by conventional models of Sumerian cultural capability. The hydraulic knowledge visible at Tell es-Sowon does not exist in isolation, but forms part of a pattern of advanced engineering capability that appears across the earliest recoverable levels of multiple southern Mesopotamian sites in ways that consistently point toward a common technical tradition rather than independent local development. At the site of Choghar-Mish in the Deiluran plain of modern Iran, excavations by the Oriental Institute of Chicago between 1961 and 1978 under the direction of Hélène Cantor and Pierre de Lugaz documented irrigation and drainage works of comparable sophistication to the Tell es-Sowon systems appearing at occupation levels dating to approximately 5,500 BC. The Choghar-Mish hydraulic infrastructure and the Tell es-Sowon system are separated by approximately 300 kilometers and appear to reflect the same engineering principles applied to different local terrain conditions, a pattern more consistent with the distribution of a codified technical tradition than with the independent development of equivalent solutions by separate communities. The Mul.Apin astronomical compendium, known from multiple cuneiform copies spanning the period from approximately 1000 BC through the Seleucid era, represents the most comprehensive astronomical reference document to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, and contains within its star catalogues and planetary tables a level of mathematical precision that consistently surprises modern researchers encountering it for the first time. The text takes its name from its opening words, which refer to the Plough constellation, and organizes its contents around three celestial pathways designated the Way of Anu, the Way of Enlil, and the Way of Ea, dividing the observable sky into three bands corresponding to northern, equatorial, and southern declination zones. The star positions recorded within each pathway include coordinates of such precision that modern astronomers using computational retrograde software to match them against actual stellar positions have found systematic deviations suggesting either the data was collected during a period significantly earlier than the tablet's physical composition dates, or that the measurements were made from observation points other than the surface of the Earth at the latitudes of Mesopotamian cities. Tablet K6174 from the British Museum collection, one of the best preserved copies of the Mul.Apin corpus, contains planetary period relations for Venus that predict synodic cycle completions accurate to within 1 day across spans of 100 years. A predictive precision that modern celestial mechanics confirms is mathematically achievable only through either extended continuous observation records spanning multiple centuries or access to derived theoretical models of planetary motion that were not supposed to exist until the Hellenistic period at the earliest. The structural organization of the Mul.Apin text itself reveals layers of astronomical sophistication that reward careful analysis. The three pathways of the sky are not simply a convenient organizational scheme for listing stars. They encode a coordinate system that divides the celestial sphere into zones defined by declination boundaries at approximately 17 degrees north and 17 degrees south of the celestial equator. Boundaries that correspond to the limits of the Sun's annual movement along the ecliptic when viewed from the latitudes of central Mesopotamia. This coordinate system requires not only the recognition that the Sun follows a path through the fixed stars across the year, but also the precise quantification of the angular extent of that path and its relationship to the observer's terrestrial latitude. A suite of geometric relationships that in the formal history of astronomy is associated with the development of spherical geometry during the Greek period. The presence of this coordinate system in a text whose oldest identifiable sources appear to date to the Middle Assyrian period of approximately 1200 BC, and which internal astronomical evidence suggests incorporates observational data of even greater antiquity, implies that its compilers were working within an astronomical tradition that had already solved the basic problems of spherical, celestial geometry long before Greek astronomers are supposed to have formulated them. The stellar position data within the Mul.Apin pathways has been subjected to detailed computational analysis by several research teams working independently. Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in his 2011 study Mesopotamian Cosmic Geography, cross-referenced the stellar positions listed in the Mul.Apin star catalogues against modern astronomical databases using retrograde computation to determine at which historical epoch the listed positions would have corresponded most closely to actual observed stellar locations. His analysis produced a consistent best-fit date of approximately 1400 BC for the equatorial and southern pathway stars, while the northern pathway stars yielded a best-fit date approximately 3 to 4 centuries earlier, suggesting that the catalogue was compiled from observational records accumulated across a period of several centuries rather than in a single systematic survey. This conclusion is significant because it implies an institutional continuity of astronomical observation, maintained for hundreds of years before the composition of the text, precisely the kind of multi-generational observational program that would be required to detect and quantify the slow drift of precessional motion across the zodiacal constellations. The Venus period relations preserved in the Mul.Apin text connect the compendium to one of the most analytically productive bodies of evidence in ancient Mesopotamian astronomy, the Venus tablets of Amisaduqa. These tablets, known from multiple copies in the Nineveh archive and designated in the British Museum catalogue as K160, K2156, and related fragments, record the dates of first and last visibilities of the planet Venus over a period of approximately 21 years during the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, who ruled sometime in the period from approximately 1646 to 1626 BC, according to the Middle Chronology. The observation records in these tablets allow modern astronomers to calculate the dates of Venus's synodic cycles with sufficient precision to serve as anchor points for the absolute chronology of the early Babylonian period, and they have been the subject of sustained analysis by researchers including Peter Huber of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, whose 1982 study Astronomical Dating of Babylon 1 and Ur 3 demonstrated that the Venus observation records achieve a systematic accuracy inconsistent with naked eye observation conducted without formal mathematical modelling of the planet's orbital behaviour. The implication, which Huber approached cautiously but did not avoid, is that the Babylonian astronomers who compiled these records were using theoretical models to smooth and correct their raw observations, employing a mathematical sophistication that the standard history of ancient astronomy places several centuries later. Rising from the desert plain of southern Iraq to a height that dominated the Uruk cityscape for a radius of dozens of kilometers, the Anu ziggurat complex represents one of the earliest and most technically demanding construction achievements yet identified in the ancient world, and its architectural features reveal engineering knowledge whose sophistication becomes increasingly apparent under systematic analysis. Excavations conducted by the German Archaeological Institute at Uruk between 1912 and the late 20th century established that the Anu ziggurat as it existed around 3200 BC consisted of a massive terraced platform approximately 40 meters in height, constructed from millions of standardized mud bricks, whose dimensions reflect a consistent modular system applied across the entire structure. The white temple that crowned this platform, named for the white gypsum plaster coating its exterior walls, was oriented to within fractions of a degree of true cardinal directions, an alignment achieved through astronomical observation methods whose precision matches the documented capabilities of much later Greek and Egyptian architects. Sound tests conducted within the preserved chambers of the Anu ziggurat complex during the 1980s by acoustic researchers affiliated with the German Oriental Society revealed resonance properties that indicate the internal spaces were designed with deliberate attention to sound behavior, creating amplification effects at specific frequencies that would project a human voice from the central chamber outward across the surrounding platform without artificial amplification, suggesting that the structure's designers possessed advanced understanding of acoustic wave propagation and architectural sound management. The engineering achievement represented by the Anu ziggurat platform requires quantification to be properly appreciated. The structure as it existed in the Uruk period required the manufacture, transport and precise placement of an estimated 4 million standardized mud bricks, each measuring approximately 30 centimeters by 15 centimeters by 8 centimeters, according to the dimensional analysis conducted by the German Archaeological Institute team. The brick dimensions are not arbitrary, but reflect a consistent modular ratio of approximately 4 to 2 to 1 between length, width, and height, a ratio that appears in mud brick construction across multiple Mesopotamian sites of the period, and that produces a structural interlocking pattern when the bricks are laid in alternating courses that maximizes the shear resistance of the resulting wall. The consistency of these dimensions across millions of individual bricks implies either a centralized production system with standardized forming molds and quality control procedures, or a measurement tradition sufficiently codified that multiple independent production units could achieve the same output specifications. Either interpretation implies an organizational and metrological sophistication that exceeds what conventional models predict for Uruk period society. The astronomical orientation of the White Temple atop the Anu ziggurat has been systematically analyzed by archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte of the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias, whose 2009 study Astronomy and Power, How Worlds Are Structured, documented that the temple's orientation to within approximately 2 degrees of true north was achieved through a method that required identifying true north through stellar observation rather than through magnetic compass readings, which were unavailable to Mesopotamian builders. The most reliable stellar method for establishing true north available to ancient observers involves identifying the point of minimum azimuth oscillation of a circumpolar star across multiple nights of observation, a process requiring a fixed observation platform, a reliable sighting instrument maintaining a consistent azimuth reference, and the mathematical capacity to average multiple observations to reduce random error. The precision achieved at the White Temple implies that the Uruk period architects either possessed this observational methodology or had access to a pre-established north reference that they replicated from an earlier survey, both of which imply astronomical knowledge significantly beyond the developmental stage at which the Uruk period is conventionally placed. The construction sequence of the Anu ziggurat also reveals strategic planning across architectural generations that implies institutional continuity of a distinctive kind. The German Archaeological Institute's stratigraphic analysis established that the ziggurat platform was enlarged and heightened through multiple successive construction phases spanning several centuries, with each phase carefully designed to incorporate the previous structure rather than replace it. This additive construction logic, which required each generation of builders to understand and respect the structural intentions of their predecessors, while extending the design toward a predetermined larger form, implies that the architectural program governing the structure's development was maintained as a stable institutional intention across periods that in Mesopotamian political history were marked by dynastic change, military conflict, and cultural disruption. The capacity to maintain a multi-generational construction program of this consistency and precision implies archival and educational institutions capable of preserving both the technical knowledge and the design intentions of the original architects across centuries of implementation. Among the approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, a subset classified by modern researchers as medical and pharmaceutical texts reveals a systematic understanding of human anatomy, disease causation, and therapeutic intervention, whose sophistication consistently surprises medical historians, encountering the original documents rather than simplified scholarly summaries. The diagnostic handbook, known in Akkadian as the Sakiku, reconstructed from multiple tablet series spread across the British Museum and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, consists of 40 tablets organized by anatomical region that record clinical observations, differential diagnoses, treatment protocols, and prognosis in a format structurally identical to modern medical case records. The text employs standardized terminology for describing symptoms with a precision that allows modern medical researchers to identify the conditions being described with reasonable confidence, and its treatment recommendations include pharmacological preparations combining specific plant compounds, mineral substances, and animal derivatives in dosages and combinations that modern pharmacological analysis has confirmed possess genuine therapeutic efficacy for the indicated conditions. Specific surgical procedures referenced in the Nineveh medical corpus include the removal of cataracts through needling techniques, drainage of abscesses through precise incision protocols, and cranial trepanation procedures described with sufficient anatomical detail that modern neurosurgeons recognize them as functionally sound approaches to reducing intracranial pressure. The instruments specified for these procedures include bronze blades of defined dimensions and obsidian cutting edges, whose sharpness characteristics the texts explicitly distinguish from bronze, indicating that Mesopotamian surgeons understood that naturally fractured obsidian produces cutting edges superior to any metal available to them, a fact confirmed by modern materials science. The Sakiku's organizational structure reveals a level of systematic medical thinking that conventional histories of ancient medicine rarely credit to Mesopotamian sources. The 40 tablets of the handbook are organized according to a consistent clinical logic, beginning with tablets covering symptoms observed in the patient's general appearance and behavior before examining the physician, progressing through systematic regional examination from head to foot, and concluding with prognostic tablets that evaluate outcomes for different categories of presentation. This organizational scheme reflects the same clinical examination sequence taught in modern medical schools as the basis of systematic physical diagnosis, demonstrating that Mesopotamian medical practitioners had developed a formalized and reproducible examination protocol rather than relying on idiosyncratic individual approaches. Medical historian John Scurlock of Elmhurst College, whose 2014 translation and analysis of the Sakiku, titled Sourcebook for Ancient Mesopotamian Medicine, represents the most comprehensive scholarly engagement with this text in English, documented over 900 individual diagnostic entries within the handbook's 40 tablets, and noted that a substantial proportion of the treatment recommendations, when evaluated against modern pharmacological knowledge, contain active compounds with demonstrable therapeutic relevance to the conditions they were recorded as addressing. The pharmacological sophistication of the Mesopotamian medical corpus extends beyond the Sakiku to a parallel body of purely pharmaceutical texts that record compound preparation procedures for an extensive materia medica. The pharmaceutical series known as the Uruana, preserved in copies from the Nineveh Library and from Babylonian temple archives, catalogues over 500 plant, mineral, and animal substances with their identified therapeutic properties and preparation methods. Analysis of the Uruana conducted by pharmaceutical historian John Riddle of North Carolina State University established that the text demonstrates knowledge of drug interactions, dose-response relationships, and the distinction between therapeutic and toxic doses that in the formal history of pharmacology is associated with the Renaissance work of Paracelsus in the 16th century AD. The Uruana specifies, for example, that certain plant-derived compounds effective in small doses for treating fever become dangerous at higher doses, and it records the threshold quantities at which specific preparations transition from therapeutic to harmful, indicating that Mesopotamian pharmacologists had conducted the kind of systematic dose-effect investigation that constitutes the methodological foundation of modern toxicology. The surgical knowledge preserved in the Mesopotamian medical corpus connects directly to a physical archaeological record that conventional histories of ancient medicine rarely discuss. Cranial trepanation, the surgical removal of a disc of bone from the skull to relieve intracranial pressure, is one of the oldest documented surgical procedures in the archaeological record, with trepanned skulls recovered from sites dating back to the Neolithic period across multiple continents. The evidence for survival following trepanation in the ancient world, assessed through the presence of bone regrowth around the trepanation opening in recovered skulls, indicates that a substantial proportion of patients survived the procedure long enough for healing to begin, implying surgical technique and post-operative care sufficiently effective to prevent the immediate infection and blood loss that would otherwise be fatal outcomes. The Mesopotamian medical texts provide the procedural context for this archaeological evidence, describing trepanation not as a ritual or experimental intervention, but as a clinical response to specific diagnostic presentations, including head injuries with loss of consciousness, persistent headache with visual disturbance, and what the text describes as the head pressing down. A symptom cluster that modern neurologists recognize as consistent with increased intracranial pressure from subdural hematoma or cerebral edema. The clinical specificity of these indications implies diagnostic reasoning operating at a level of anatomical understanding that conventional models do not attribute to ancient Mesopotamian medicine. When Leonard Woolley's expedition from the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania completed its first major excavation season at the ancient city of in 1929, the discovery that commanded immediate international attention was not the spectacular royal cemetery that had consumed the previous years of work, but a sterile layer of water-deposited silt located approximately 4 meters below the cemetery level that separated two distinct occupation phases with no transitional material between them. Woolley measured this flood deposit at approximately 2.5 meters in thickness at the excavation point, composed of clean water-laid silt containing no cultural material whatsoever, meaning no pottery, no tools, no ash, no organic debris of any kind associated with human habitation. Above the silt layer, normal Sumerian urban deposits continued in unbroken sequence back toward the surface. Below it, a completely different cultural assemblage appeared, with pottery types, architectural forms, and material culture characteristics that matched the pre-Sumerian Ubaid period, rather than any phase of the Sumerian sequence above. Woolley's conclusion, announced in a telegram that generated headlines across Europe and America, was that his team had found physical evidence of the biblical flood. Subsequent scholarly analysis of his stratigraphic data has been more cautious, noting that similar flood deposits identified at Kish, Shuruppak and Lagash do not all date to the same period, suggesting either multiple regional flood events or a more complex depositional history than a single global inundation. But what has received far less attention in these methodological debates is the nature of the cultural discontinuity the flood layer represents, specifically the fact that the civilization appearing above the silt in every case demonstrates capabilities significantly beyond what existed below it, as though the communities that rebuilt after the inundation had access to knowledge their predecessors lacked. The physical characteristics of Woolley's flood deposit at deserve careful examination because they contain information that his original interpretive framework did not fully exploit. The silt layer, when analysed in detail, consists of water-laid sediment whose particle size distribution and depositional structure indicate sustained high-velocity water flow, rather than the gradual seasonal flooding that characterises normal Mesopotamian inundation events. The absence of any graded bedding within the deposit, which would be expected if the water rose and fell gradually as in a river flood, and the presence instead of a structurally uniform deposit suggesting rapid deposition from sustained turbulent flow, indicates a flood event of unusual hydrological character. Subsequent geomorphological analysis of similar flood deposits at Kish by archaeologist and geomorphologist Harriet Crawford of University College London identified sediment transport distances for material within the flood layer that implied water velocities inconsistent with any local river source, suggesting that the inundation responsible for the deposit involved water movement on a scale and at a velocity that ordinary Mesopotamian flooding cannot account for. The cultural discontinuity above and below the flood layer at multiple Mesopotamian sites represents an analytical problem that has never been satisfactorily resolved within conventional developmental frameworks. At The pottery tradition below the silt belongs firmly to the regional Ubaid continuum that archaeologists trace across southern Mesopotamia from approximately 5,500 BC forward. The pottery appearing immediately above the silt, without any transitional forms bridging the gap, reflects the early Uruk tradition with its distinctive new vessel forms, surface treatments, and production technologies that imply not the gradual evolution of the Ubaid tradition, but its replacement by a qualitatively different ceramic system. The standard explanation that the flood layer represents a relatively brief interruption in occupation followed by resettlement by a population already familiar with Uruk-style ceramic production merely relocates the analytical problem rather than resolving it. Because the question of where the Uruk ceramic tradition developed and how it achieved its sudden regional predominance across southern Mesopotamia remains unanswered by the stratigraphic evidence at and the comparable sites. The flood layer, in other words, marks a before and after boundary in Mesopotamian cultural development, whose significance extends well beyond the localized flooding event that deposited the silt. The Sumerian textual tradition treats the flood as precisely this kind of civilizational boundary, and its descriptions of the post-flood reconstruction of civilization under divine guidance provide a framework for interpreting the archaeological discontinuity that mainstream scholarship declines to take seriously, but has not produced a comparably detailed alternative explanation for. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Old Babylonian copies from approximately 1700 BC, but drawing from Sumerian originals of the 3rd millennium BC, describes the post-flood period as one in which the surviving human community received renewed divine instruction in the arts of civilization, including agricultural management, urban planning, and the governance structures necessary for organized social life. This description, read against the archaeological evidence of sudden cultural discontinuity above flood layers at multiple Mesopotamian sites, maps onto the physical record with a coherence that the conventional explanations of internal regional development do not achieve. The knowledge that appears above the flood layers at Kish, Shuruppak, and Lagash is not the knowledge of a local community resuming interrupted development. It is the knowledge of a civilization that arrived in demonstrably advanced form. At the moment the waters receded, the systematic comparative analysis of flood narratives across independent human cultures represents one of the most compelling bodies of evidence for a genuine catastrophic event of global scope occurring within the period of human civilization. And the specific technical details shared across traditions that had no documented historical contact constitute a category of evidence that conventional mythology studies has never adequately explained. Researcher and comparative mythologist Dr. Adrian Mayer, in her systematic compilation of flood traditions from cultures on every inhabited continent, documented over 500 distinct cultural narratives describing a catastrophic inundation that destroyed a previous world, preserved a small group of survivors through a vessel or elevated refuge, and inaugurated a new phase of human civilization following the water's recession. The methodological challenge in dismissing this distribution as coincidental independent invention lies not in the existence of flood stories across cultures, since flooding is a universal human experience that would naturally generate local mythologies, but in the specific technical details that recur across traditions separated by oceans and millennia with a consistency that independent invention cannot account for. The duration of the flood is specified in the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh as 150 days from the beginning of the inundation to the grounding of the vessel, and this same duration of 150 days appears in the Hopi oral tradition of the flood of Sotuknang, preserved by a culture in the American Southwest that had no contact with Mesopotamian civilization until the modern era. The construction material of the survival vessel is described as sealed with bituminous pitch in the Mesopotamian accounts, and the same specific waterproofing material appears in the Cherokee tradition of the Great Boat built before the waters rose, despite bituminous pitch being a notably specialized material whose specification in both contexts argues against coincidental narrative convergence. The analytical methodology required to evaluate cross-cultural flood narrative parallels responsibly demands distinguishing between general thematic similarities, which can plausibly result from the universal human experience of catastrophic flooding, and specific technical details whose precise recurrence across independent traditions cannot be accounted for by independent invention. General thematic similarities include the concept of a catastrophic flood, survival by a small group, and the inauguration of a new world order following the disaster. These themes do appear widely, and their broad distribution does not by itself constitute evidence for a shared historical memory. The evidentiary weight lies instead in the layer of technical specificity that sits beneath these broad themes, and that exhibits cross-cultural consistency at a level of detail that makes independent inventions statistically implausible. The specific duration of 150 days for the primary inundation phase, appearing in both Mesopotamian and Hopi traditions, is not a narratively necessary detail. A flood story functions perfectly well without specifying its duration, and if both traditions had independently invented this detail, the probability that they would have independently arrived at the same number is determined by the range of plausible flood durations, which encompasses at minimum several orders of magnitude of variation. The consistent specification of 150 days across traditions separated by the width of the Atlantic Ocean and thousands of years of independent cultural development is not a detail that the framework of independent mythological invention accommodates without special pleading. The structural details of survival vessels across flood traditions provide an additional category of specific technical convergence that conventional mythology studies has not adequately addressed. The Mesopotamian flood accounts, including both the Sumerian Ziusudra tradition and the Akkadian Utnapishtim account preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, specify that the survival vessel was compartmentalized into multiple internal divisions, waterproofed with bituminous pitch, applied to both interior and exterior surfaces, and loaded with representatives of every category of living creature. The compartmentalization detail appears in the Andean flood tradition of Tespi preserved by the Aztec, which describes a vessel with enclosed compartments housing different animal species in separate sections, a structural feature that serves no obvious narrative purpose, but that corresponds to the practical requirement of preventing animal species from preying on each other during extended confinement. The Maori flood tradition of Ruatapu, preserved in New Zealand, specifies that the survival vessel was sealed against water infiltration, using a plant-based caulking compound applied at all joints, a constructional detail that corresponds to the caulking procedures described in the Mesopotamian accounts, without the specific identification of bituminous pitch that appears in the traditions of cultures inhabiting regions where natural bitumen seeps were available. The systematic variation in the specific caulking material specified, while maintaining the structural concept of applied waterproofing across all traditions, is itself analytically significant because it suggests adaptation of a shared technical memory to locally available materials rather than direct textual borrowing. The astronomical details embedded in flood traditions from multiple continents provide a further category of technical convergence whose analytical significance has been explored most systematically by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von de Chend in Hamlet's Mill. Multiple flood traditions specify that the catastrophe was preceded or accompanied by anomalous celestial phenomena, including unusual star positions, the appearance of new bright objects in the sky, and changes in the rising and setting positions of familiar constellations. The Aztec tradition specifies that the flood of the fourth sun was accompanied by the cessation of the sun's movement in the sky, a description that de Santillana and von der Schend interpreted as a processional marker indicating a specific epoch when the equinoctial sun occupied a particular zodiacal position. The Polynesian flood traditions consistently reference the stars dancing differently in the sky during the period of the inundation, a description whose technical content, if taken literally, corresponds to the kind of apparent stellar displacement that would result from a significant and rapid change in the orientation of Earth's rotational axis. The precision with which these astronomical accompaniments to the flood are specified across independent traditions argues for their derivation from actual observational records of celestial anomalies, coinciding with the catastrophic event rather than their independent mythological invention as symbolic accompaniments to the flood. Narrative. The seasonal timing of the flood specified across multiple traditions provides a final category of technical detail whose cross-cultural consistency constitutes a genuine analytical challenge. The Mesopotamian accounts place the onset of the flood in the month corresponding to late winter or early spring in the Mesopotamian calendar, a timing that the astronomical accompaniments described in the tablets correlate with specific stellar configurations visible at that season. Multiple independent traditions from the Northern Hemisphere, including Celtic, Norse and Vedic flood accounts, specify late winter or early spring timing for the catastrophe, while Southern Hemisphere traditions, including the Andean accounts, place the disaster in the season corresponding to late summer of the southern year, which is the same absolute calendar period as the Northern Hemisphere late winter specification, when hemispheric seasonal inversion is taken into account. This hemispheric consistency and absolute timing, maintained across traditions with no documented contact and expressed in seasonal terms, specific to each tradition's geographical location, indicates that the flood traditions preserve a genuine memory of a catastrophe occurring at a specific time of year, rather than a mythological template that would be expected to assign the event to culturally significant seasonal markers varying by tradition. The scientific investigation of the Younger Dryas boundary layer, a stratigraphic horizon deposited approximately 12,900 years ago and identified in sediment cores and geological exposures across 4 continents, has produced accumulating physical evidence for a catastrophic cosmic impact or airburst event, whose global environmental consequences align with remarkable precision with the flood and destruction traditions preserved in ancient texts worldwide. The Younger Dryas climate event itself, a rapid return to near-glacial conditions following a warming trend, had been recognized by climatologists since the mid-20th century as among the most abrupt and severe climate transitions in the recent geological record, with ice core data from Greenland's GISP2 core indicating temperature drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius occurring within decades rather than the millennia typical of gradual glacial interglacial transitions. The impact hypothesis for the Younger Dryas onset, first formally proposed by a team of 26 researchers led by R.B. Firestone in a 2007 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, identified a suite of physical markers at the Younger Dryas boundary including nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, magnetic spherules, shocked quartz, and carbon spherules consistent with high-temperature impact or airburst processes at sites spanning North America, Europe, and Western Asia. The platinum anomaly within this boundary layer, documented at sites as geographically diverse as the Greenland ice cores, the Palauco site in Chile, and exposure profiles in Belgium and South Africa, indicates the presence of extraterrestrial material distributed across the entire globe rather than concentrated at a single impact site, consistent with the fragmentation and atmospheric dispersal of a large cometary body entering Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle. The physical evidence for the Younger Dryas impact event has been substantially strengthened by independent research programs operating across multiple disciplines since the Firestone team's original 2007 publication. The nanodiamond evidence, initially contested by researchers who argued that the identified particles were misidentified graphene rather than impact-generated diamonds, was subjected to independent verification by James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, whose 2009 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences employed transmission electron microscopy and electron energy loss spectroscopy to confirm the identification of Lonsdales, a hexagonal form of diamond produced specifically under the extreme pressure and temperature conditions of cosmic impact. In Younger Dryas boundary sediments from multiple sites across North America, Lonsdale does not form through any known terrestrial geological process, and its presence in a stratigraphic horizon coinciding with the onset of the Younger Dryas climate event constitutes unambiguous physical evidence for a high-energy impact event at that boundary. The geographic distribution of the impact markers across the Younger Dryas boundary has been systematically expanded through research published between 2007 and the present, with boundary layer samples now confirming the presence of the full impact proxy suite at sites in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, South Africa, Chile, Peru, and across the European continent, in addition to the original North American sample sites. The global extent of this distribution, documented by Joanne Ballard of the University of Kansas in a 2018 meta-analysis of published Younger Dryas boundary data, is inconsistent with a single localized impact event and consistent instead with the aerial fragmentation and dispersal of a large impactor, most likely a comet with a nucleus diameter estimated at approximately 100 kilometers based on the energy calculations required to account for the observed distribution and concentration of impact proxies. The fragmentation of a comet of this scale in Earth's atmosphere would produce multiple simultaneous airbursts and surface impacts across a wide swathe of the northern hemisphere, generating atmospheric shock waves, thermal pulses, and tsunami-generating ocean impacts whose combined environmental effects would constitute a global catastrophe of precisely the character described in flood traditions worldwide. The carbon spheruleal evidence within the younger Dryas boundary layer provides independent confirmation of the continental-scale wildfire that would be expected to result from a large cometary fragmentation event. Carbon spherules of the type recovered from the boundary layer are produced by the rapid combustion of organic material at temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, temperatures that occur during lightning strikes and cosmic impact events, but not during the ordinary forest fires that characterize interglacial periods. Concentration mapping of carbon spherules across North American boundary layer samples, conducted by Ted Bunch of Northern Arizona University, and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, demonstrates a distribution pattern consistent with simultaneous ignition of vegetation across an area encompassing most of the North American continent north of approximately 30 degrees latitude, providing physical confirmation of the continental scale burning that flood traditions across multiple cultures describe as accompanying or preceding the Great Inundation. The environmental consequences of the Younger Dryas impact event for any advanced human civilization existing in the affected regions would have been catastrophic in precisely the way that flood and destruction traditions describe. The rapid climate cooling documented in the GISP2 ice core would have destroyed agricultural systems within a single growing season. The continental-scale fires would have eliminated forest ecosystems across vast areas, and the tsunamis generated by oceanic impact fragments would have inundated coastal settlements to depths and distances far exceeding any normal flooding event. A civilization concentrated in coastal and riverine environments, as all early civilizations are known to have been, would have been devastated with a thoroughness that would explain both the absence of physical remains from pre-Younger Dryas advanced cultures and the sudden appearance of reconstituted civilizational knowledge at sites like Eridu and Uruk several thousand years after the boundary event. Once human populations had recovered sufficiently to rebuild the institutional frameworks necessary for transmitting preserved technical knowledge. The excavation of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, initiated by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in 1995 and continuing under the direction of the German Archaeological Institute until Schmidt's death in 2014, has generated what may be the single most consequential archaeological discovery of the late 20th century, fundamentally revising the timeline of organized religious architecture and sophisticated stone construction in human prehistory. The site, located atop a limestone ridge in the Taurus Mountain foothills, approximately 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, consists of at least 20 circular or oval enclosures constructed from T-shaped limestone pillars ranging in height from 1.5 to 5.5 meters and in weight from 10 to 50 tons, arranged in concentric rings and decorated with bas-relief carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures of exceptional artistic quality. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the construction Fils places the earliest enclosures at the site at approximately 9,600 BC, making Göbekli Tepe roughly 7,000 years older than Stonehenge and predating the earliest known agricultural settlements by 2,000 years. The implications of this dating for conventional models of cultural development are profound, because the construction of the Göbekli Tepe enclosures required the quarrying, transport and precision erection of multi-ton limestone blocks by a population that, according to the same conventional models, should have been organized as mobile hunter-gatherers incapable of sustaining the labor coordination, architectural planning, and specialized craft knowledge that the structures demand. More puzzling than the construction itself is the deliberate and systematic burial of the entire complex around 8000 BC, a process that Schmidt's team documented through careful analysis of the fill material, which proved to consist of clean soil and stone debris deposited intentionally rather than accumulated through natural erosion, suggesting a conscious decision to seal and preserve the site rather than simply abandon it. The labor requirements for constructing the Göbekli Tepe enclosures provide the starting point for understanding why the site poses such a fundamental challenge to conventional developmental models. engineering analysis of the construction process, conducted by researchers at the German Archaeological Institute and published in the Journal of World Prehistory in 2012, estimated that quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting a single T-shaped pillar of average dimensions would have required a minimum of 500 person days of coordinated skilled labour, using only the stone tools recovered at the site. The site's 20 or more enclosures, each containing between 4 and 12 pillars in addition to the surrounding wall system, imply a total construction labour investment measured in the hundreds of thousands of person days, a figure that requires a population base and organisational structure capable of sustaining specialised non-food producing labour on a scale that conventional models associate with settled agricultural societies, not with the mobile forager communities that the same conventional models place in southeastern Turkey at 9600 BC. Klaus Schmidt himself concluded before his death that Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that complex religious and architectural organisation preceded agriculture rather than following it, inverting the conventional developmental sequence that has underpinned archaeological theory for half a century. The iconographic content of the Göbekli Tepe carvings provides additional analytical leverage that has received insufficient attention in mainstream discussions of the site. The animal representations carved on the T-shaped pillars include species that are native to the region, such as aurochs, foxes, and cranes, alongside representations of species including lions and vultures that appear in consistent symbolic contexts across later ancient Near Eastern religious iconography, suggesting that the symbolic vocabulary of Mesopotamian religious art has roots at Göbekli Tepe that extend back several thousand years before the emergence of Sumerian civilization. More significantly, several pillars at the site carry carved representations of humanoid figures whose proportions and postures differ from the naturalistic animal carvings in ways that suggest intentional stylization rather than failed naturalism, with elongated limbs, formalized hand positions, and abstract facial treatments that correspond to conventions in the representation of divine or superhuman figures in later ancient Near Eastern art. Archaeoastronomer Giulio Magli of the Politecnico di Milano published an analysis in 2013 demonstrating that the layout of the Göbekli Tepe enclosures incorporates astronomical alignments oriented toward the rising position of Sirius at the site's latitude during the construction period, indicating that the site's builders possessed knowledge of stellar observation and could plan large-scale architectural layouts in reference to celestial phenomena. The deliberate burial of the Göbekli Tepe complex around 8000 BC represents the most analytically challenging aspect of the site's history. Schmidt's systematic analysis of the fill deposits established that the burial was carried out in multiple phases using material transported from outside the enclosures, indicating sustained organised effort rather than a single, rapid infill event. The fill material was deposited carefully enough to preserve the carved pillar surfaces in exceptional condition, suggesting that the burial was understood by those carrying it out as a preservation measure rather than a destruction. The timing of the burial coincides approximately with the period when agricultural settlements began appearing across the surrounding region, raising the possibility that the decision to seal the site was connected to a transition in the social organisation of the population responsible for its maintenance. Whatever the immediate motivation, the result was that a complex embodying sophisticated astronomical knowledge, large-scale organisational capability, and a coherent symbolic vocabulary was deliberately sealed and preserved beneath several metres of fill material precisely at the moment when the human communities of the region were undergoing their most significant developmental transition. The question of who made this decision, why, and what they understood about the knowledge they were choosing to preserve rather than destroy or simply abandon remains one of the most compelling unsolved problems in the archaeology of the ancient world. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered in 1901 from the wreck of a Roman-era cargo vessel located at a depth of approximately 43 metres off the southern coast of the Greek island of Antikythera, represents a physical artefact whose engineering sophistication so far exceeded the documented technological context of its era that its true nature as a sophisticated astronomical computing device was not fully recognised for more than 50 years after its discovery. Initial examination of the corroded bronze fragments by Greek archaeologist Valerios Stais in 1902 identified the presence of gears and inscribed text. But the full complexity of the mechanism's design was only revealed through X-ray analysis conducted by Derek de Solla, Price of Yale University in the 1950s and 1960s, and subsequently through high-resolution CT scanning by Tony Freeth and the Antikythera research team in 2006, work published in the journal Nature under the title Decoding the Ancient Greek Astronomical Calculator, known as the Antikythera mechanism. The CT analysis revealed a device consisting of at least 37 bronze gears, and possibly as many as 72 in its complete original form, arranged in a gear train of extraordinary mechanical complexity that computed the positions of the Sun and Moon in the zodiac, predicted lunar and solar eclipses using the Saros cycle of 223 lunar months, tracked the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, and displayed a planetary model whose reconstruction by University College London researchers in 2021 indicated the device also modelled the motions of all 5 planets known to ancient Greek astronomy. The differential gear mechanism at the heart of the device's lunar anomaly calculation, which adjusts the displayed moon position to account for the varying speed of lunar motion around its elliptical orbit, is a mechanical engineering principle that was not believed to have been reinvented until the 16th century AD, creating a documented technological gap of approximately 1,400 years between the Antikythera mechanism and the next equivalent achievement in the history of mechanical computation. The metallurgical analysis of the Antikythera mechanism's bronze components provides important context for evaluating its place within the technological history of the ancient world. X-ray fluorescence analysis conducted by the Antikythera research team established that the mechanism's gears were fabricated from a bronze alloy, with a composition of approximately 95% copper, 4.5% tin, and trace quantities of lead and iron. A composition that falls within the range of high-quality instrument bronze used for precision applications in the Hellenistic period, and that produces a material combining sufficient hardness for gear tooth durability with the ductility needed for precision machining. The gear teeth show evidence of finishing by file or scraping tools after initial casting, a manufacturing sequence that requires knowledge of the final dimensional requirements, precise enough to guide hand finishing toward tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. The surface of the surviving gear teeth, analysed through 3-dimensional imaging by the Hewlett-Packard imaging team that contributed to the 2006 Nature study, shows toolmark patterns consistent with systematic progressive finishing, rather than the irregular marks of purely aesthetic surface treatment, indicating that the craftsmen who produced these gears were working to functional dimensional specifications rather than merely to visual appearance standards. The inscriptions preserved on the mechanism's surviving fragments provide crucial evidence for the astronomical knowledge base from which the device was designed. The back cover inscription, partially reconstructed from multiple fragments by the Antikythera research team's epigraphers, contains what appears to be an instruction manual describing the operation of the device's dials and the astronomical cycles they track. The text references the Metonic cycle of 19 years, across which the solar and lunar calendars realign, the Saros cycle of 223 lunar months used for eclipse prediction, and the Calippic cycle of 76 years, a refinement of the Metonic cycle developed by the Greek astronomer Callippus of Cyzicus in the 4th century BC. The presence of the Calippic cycle as a design parameter establishes a construction date no earlier than the mid-4th century BC for the device's astronomical design basis. But the mechanical implementation of these cycles through the gear train involves engineering solutions that demonstrably exceed the mechanical technology documented in any other surviving artifact from the Hellenistic period. The mechanism therefore represents either the apex of a mechanical engineering tradition whose other products have entirely failed to survive the archaeological record, or the product of a knowledge tradition that had access to engineering principles not generated through the documented developmental sequence of Greek mechanical arts. The archaeological site of Pumapunku, located on the Bolivian Altiplano approximately 70 kilometers west of the modern city of La Paz, at an elevation of approximately 3,860 meters above sea level, presents a collection of andesite and red sandstone architectural blocks whose cutting precision and geometric complexity constitute one of the most persistent and underexplained anomalies in the study of pre-Columbian South American civilization. The site, dating to the Tiwanaku IV period at approximately 500 to 900 AD, according to conventional archaeological consensus, though with disputed evidence for significantly earlier occupation phases, contains massive architectural elements whose surfaces display machined quality flatness tolerances and geometric precision that challenge straightforward explanations based on known Andean stoneworking technologies. Archaeologist Alexei Vranich of the University of California, Berkeley, who conducted systematic survey and analysis of the Pumapunku architectural remains, documented H-shaped stone blocks carved from a single piece of andesite that incorporate internal right-angle channels, parallel grooves of consistent depth and width, and precisely fitting interlocking joints whose mating tolerances are measured in fractions of a millimetre rather than the centimetre scale approximations typical of hand tool stoneworking. The nearest source of the grey andesite used for many of the largest Pumapunku blocks has been identified through petrographic analysis as the Copacabana Peninsula on the opposite shore of Lake Titicaca, approximately 90 kilometres from the site. Requiring transport across water and high-altitude terrain of blocks, some of which weigh in excess of 130 tonnes, a logistical challenge that no experimental archaeology project has yet satisfactorily demonstrated as achievable using documented pre-Columbian technologies. The surface finish quality of the Pumapunku andesite blocks requires detailed examination because it constitutes the most technically challenging aspect of the site's construction record. The flatness of the finished surfaces on the H-shaped blocks has been measured by multiple research teams using precision straight edges and feeler gauges, with consistent results indicating surface deviations of less than half a millimetre across spans of 1 metre or more. This flatness tolerance is not achieved by any documented ancient stoneworking technique using abrasive tools, which produce surfaces whose flatness is limited by the grain size of the abrasive compound and the consistency of pressure application across the worked surface. Achieving sub-millimetre flatness across a 1 metre span using abrasive working requires either abrasive materials finer than any identified in the Pumapunku tool assemblage, mechanical grinding apparatus capable of maintaining consistent contact pressure across the full working surface simultaneously, or a combination of precision measurement and progressive removal techniques sophisticated enough to identify and correct surface high points at the millimetre scale across large areas. The Pumapunku tool assemblage recovered from excavations at the site consists primarily of harder stone implements, copper tools, and abrasive compounds of the grades expected for the Tiwanaku cultural period, none of which in experimental replication studies has produced surface finishes approaching the quality observed on the best-preserved Pumapunku blocks. The H-shaped blocks at Pumapunku present an additional analytical challenge in the precision of their internal geometry. The right-angle channels cut into these blocks, which served as structural interlocking features connecting adjacent architectural elements, maintain their angular accuracy throughout their length, with deviations from true 90 degrees measured by Vranich's team at consistently less than 1 degree. Maintaining angular accuracy of this level across channels, cut to depths of several centimetres, in hard andesite requires either a cutting tool guided by a precision angle reference maintained throughout the cutting operation, or a measurement and correction process capable of detecting and remedying angular deviations at the sub-degree level, in a cut that is being progressively deepened. Neither of these approaches is consistent with the tool assemblage documented at the site, and neither has been successfully demonstrated in experimental replication using only the tools available to Tiwanaku period stoneworkers. The parallel grooves cut across the faces of the H-shaped blocks, which served as surface texture for adhesive bonding with a copper clamp system, documented by the presence of eye-shaped copper clamp castings recovered from the site, maintain their parallelism and consistent depth with a precision that metallurgical engineer and archaeologist Roger Hopkins noted in his 2008 analysis of the site, would require a guided cutting system, maintaining fixed reference distances between adjacent cuts throughout the working operation. The artifacts known collectively as the Baghdad batteries, first identified by Wilhelm König, director of the Iraq Museum, in 1938 among objects stored in the museum's collection from excavations at the Parthian village site of Kujut Rabu near Ctesiphon, represent a category of archaeological find whose implications for the history of electrochemical knowledge have generated sustained controversy precisely because they function as described. Koenig identified a ceramic jar approximately 14 centimeters in height, containing a copper cylinder closed at one end with a copper disc and sealed with bituminous asphalt, with an iron rod suspended within the copper cylinder and insulated from it by the bituminous seal, a configuration that Koenig recognized as structurally identical to a galvanic cell or simple battery. Subsequent analysis by German researcher Arne Eggebrecht, who in 1978 constructed replicas of the Baghdad battery design and tested them with grape juice, lemon juice, and dilute sulfuric acid as electrolytes, confirmed that the assemblies produced electrical voltages between half a volt and 1.5 volts depending on the electrolyte used, sufficient to drive electroplating of thin metal coatings onto prepared surfaces. The significance of this experimental confirmation extends beyond the theoretical possibility that ancient Mesopotamian craftsmen understood galvanic electricity to the question of what they might have used it for. A question partially addressed by analysis of silver-plated copper objects from the same archaeological period that display coating characteristics including uniform thickness and strong substrate adhesion that are diagnostic of electrochemical deposition rather than mechanical application of metal leaf. The broader context of the Baghdad battery finds within Mesopotamian and ancient Near Eastern metallurgical history provides additional analytical leverage that mainstream discussions rarely develop. The Kujut Rabu site that yielded the original Koenig specimens dates to the Parthian period of approximately 250 BC to 224 AD, but Koenig's initial survey of the Iraq Museum collection identified similar assemblies among objects from a wider range of Mesopotamian contexts, including some attributable to the Sassanid period and others whose precise provenance had been inadequately recorded at the time of their recovery. The physical configuration of the devices is sufficiently consistent across multiple specimens to indicate standardized production rather than accidental construction, with the copper cylinder dimensions, iron rod proportions, and bituminous sealing techniques showing a uniformity that implies either a codified manufacturing procedure or production from a common template. Ardu Habu of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage of Iraq, in his 1992 survey of electrochemical artifacts in Iraqi museum collections, identified at least 10 distinct specimens matching the Koenig configuration spread across the collections of the Iraq Museum and the British Museum, with provenance data placing them at sites distributed across southern Mesopotamia rather than concentrated at a single production centre, suggesting that knowledge of the device's construction was geographically distributed rather than confined to a single workshop tradition. The electroplating hypothesis for the Baghdad battery's application receives its strongest support from the chemical and microstructural analysis of metal objects from contemporary archaeological context that display plating characteristics inconsistent with known ancient mechanical gilding and silvering techniques. The process of mercury amalgam gilding, which was the standard ancient technique for applying thin gold or silver coatings to base metal objects, produces coatings with a characteristic microstructure in which the precious metal layer contains residual mercury above detectable threshold concentrations and shows a diffuse interface with the substrate metal reflecting the diffusion of the amalgam into the base material during firing. Electrochemically deposited metal coatings, by contrast, produce a sharp interface between coating and substrate, contain no mercury, and display a columnar crystal growth pattern in the coating layer that reflects the directional deposition of metal ions from solution onto the substrate surface. Examination by scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray analysis of silver-coated copper objects from Parthian and Sassanid period sites in Iraq, conducted by Paul Craddock of the British Museum's Department of Scientific Research and published in his 1995 study The History of Metals, identified specimens displaying the sharp interface, columnar microstructure, and mercury-free composition diagnostic of electrochemical deposition rather than amalgam gilding, in objects whose provenance places them within the geographical and temporal range of the Baghdad battery finds. The implications of confirmed electroplating capability in ancient Mesopotamia extend into the domain of medical and pharmaceutical practice through the known antimicrobial properties of silver at the concentrations achievable through thin electro-deposited coatings. Modern medical research has confirmed that thin silver coatings on surgical instruments and medical devices reduce bacterial colonization significantly compared to uncoated surfaces, and that this effect was empirically recognized in ancient medical practice through the use of silver vessels for water storage and silver-coated utensils in contexts associated with healing temples. The Mesopotamian medical texts from the Nineveh archive describe the use of silver-containing preparations for wound treatment and infection prevention in terms that indicate empirical knowledge of silver's antimicrobial properties, and the availability of electroplating technology would have provided Mesopotamian craftsmen with a reliable method for applying thin silver coatings to medical instruments of the kind described in the Sakiku surgical texts. The convergence of electrochemical technology, medical knowledge, and antimicrobial applications in the same cultural context argues for a more integrated and sophisticated technical tradition than the conventional picture of ancient Mesopotamian technology accommodates. The distribution of similar electrochemical devices beyond Mesopotamia to sites in Egypt, the Levant, and the Iranian plateau, documented in surveys of museum collections by independent researchers, including Reinhard Habolt in his 2003 review of ancient electrical artifacts in European museum collections, suggests that knowledge of galvanic cell construction was not an isolated Mesopotamian discovery, but part of a wider technical tradition distributed across the ancient Near East through the same trade and knowledge networks that transmitted other advanced technical capabilities across the region. The consistency of device construction across geographically separated find contexts, with the copper-iron bitumen configuration appearing in virtually identical form at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and several centuries of production history, implies that this knowledge was transmitted through a codified tradition rather than independently invented at each location. The source of this tradition, like the source of the advanced hydraulic knowledge at Tel Es-Sorwan and the astronomical precision of the Mul.Apin compendium, remains unexplained by developmental models that treat the ancient Near Eastern technical tradition as an internally generated achievement of historical human communities working without access to knowledge from sources outside their documented cultural sequence. The fortress complex of Sacsayhuaman, situated on a limestone plateau overlooking the city of Cusco in the Peruvian highlands at an elevation of approximately 3,700 meters, presents construction techniques in its massive outer wall system that demonstrate engineering knowledge whose sophistication has attracted the sustained attention of structural engineers and seismologists as well as archaeologists. The outer walls of the complex consist of 3 parallel tiers of polygonal limestone blocks fitted together without mortar through a system of precisely matched irregular joints. The largest individual blocks in the lower tier measuring approximately 9 meters in height and weighing in excess of 200 tons, making them among the heaviest building stones used in any construction project in human history. Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon, writing in 1553 following his direct observation of the site within 2 decades of the Spanish conquest, stated that he could not understand how such great stones had been brought to that place and arranged with such precision that a sheet of paper could not be inserted between them, a description confirmed by modern researchers using feeler gauges to measure joint tolerances across the wall face. Structural engineer Jean-Pierre Protzen of the University of California, Berkeley, who conducted the most systematic experimental study of Inca stoneworking techniques using documented tools and methods, demonstrated in his 1993 publication Inca Architecture and Construction at Ollantaytambo that the precision-fitting characteristic of elite Inca stonework requires a sophisticated process of progressive fitting and surface testing that he termed trial and error fitting, a process whose time requirements for blocks of Sacsayhuaman scale would demand labor inputs and organizational sophistication significantly beyond what conventional models of Inca state capacity are thought to have supported. The seismic engineering properties of the Sacsayhuaman wall system have attracted specific analysis from structural engineers working on earthquake-resistant construction, because the complex's polygonal fitting system demonstrates design principles that modern earthquake engineering has independently developed and validated through both theoretical analysis and physical testing. The Cusco region sits within one of the most seismically active zones of the South American continent, subject to earthquakes of magnitude 7 and above at intervals of decades, and the historical record confirms that Sacsayhuaman has survived multiple major seismic events since the Spanish conquest, with minimal structural damage, while contemporary Spanish colonial buildings constructed on the same sites using mortared masonry collapsed or required extensive reconstruction. Structural engineer Stella Nair of the University of California, Los Angeles, in her 2015 analysis of Inca construction techniques and seismic performance, documented that the polygonal fitting system at Sacsayhuaman achieves earthquake resistance through 3 distinct mechanisms simultaneously. The irregular polygonal joint geometry prevents the formation of continuous vertical failure planes through the wall mass that would allow seismic energy to propagate as a coherent crack. The absence of mortar allows adjacent blocks to undergo small relative displacements during seismic shaking, dissipating energy through friction at the contact surfaces rather than concentrating it at rigid connections that would fail catastrophically. And the interlocking contact geometry at each joint ensures that blocks return to their original positions after displacement rather than ratcheting progressively out of alignment through repeated seismic cycles. These 3 mechanisms working in combination produce a wall system whose seismic performance matches or exceeds that of modern reinforced concrete construction for the ground motion characteristics typical of the Cusco region, and their simultaneous implementation in a single construction system implies design knowledge that encompasses both the mechanics of seismic wave propagation through masonry structures and the tribological properties of stone-on-stone contact under dynamic loading conditions. The quarry evidence for the Sacsayhuaman wall construction provides additional analytical challenges that conventional accounts understate. The limestone blocks used in the lower tiers of the wall system were quarried from outcrops located approximately 5 kilometers from the construction site, at a lower elevation requiring transport uphill across terrain, with gradients of up to 20% over portions of the route. The largest blocks in the lower tier, weighing in excess of 200 tons, exceed the capacity of any documented pre-Columbian transport technology by a substantial margin. Experimental archaeology projects attempting to demonstrate the feasibility of moving large stone blocks using only the technologies available to Inca construction teams have successfully moved blocks weighing up to 35 tons using wooden sledges, log rollers, and fiber ropes operated by teams of several hundred workers. But the scaling properties of block-moving problems are highly nonlinear, with the required workforce and infrastructure growing faster than linearly with block weight, and no experimental project has yet demonstrated a technically viable method for moving 200-ton blocks using exclusively pre-industrial technologies. The quarry sites themselves preserve unfinished blocks and tool marks that document the stone-working methods used. But the transport problem between quarry and construction site remains without a demonstrated solution that is consistent with both the physical requirements of the task and the documented technological repertoire of the Inca state. The map compiled in 919 of the Hijri calendar, corresponding to 1513 AD, by Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri ibn Haji Mehmed, known as Piri Reis, and preserved in a single surviving copy discovered in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul in 1929, presents geographical information about the coastlines of South America and a southern landmass that has generated sustained and unresolved debate among cartographic historians, geographers, and archaeologists for nearly a century. The map, drawn on gazelle skin and measuring approximately 90 by 63 centimeters, depicts the Atlantic coastlines of Europe and Africa with accuracy consistent with the best Portuguese charts of the early 16th century. But its depiction of South American coastal features and the southern continental mass raises questions about the source materials Piri Reis explicitly stated he used in its compilation. In his own marginal notations on the map, Piri Reis recorded that he had consulted approximately 20 source maps, including charts used by Christopher Columbus for his westward voyages, Arabic maps, and documents he described as originating from the time of Alexander the Great. The portion of the map depicting a southern landmass below South America shows a continuous coastline whose configuration corresponds more closely to the subglacial topography of Antarctica, as revealed by modern seismic surveys conducted during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 58, than to any speculative or imaginary southern continent depicted in contemporary 16th century. Cartography. Captain Lorenzo Burroughs of the United States Air Force, writing in a letter to Boston University professor Charles Hapgood in 1960, confirmed after comparison of the Piri Reis map with modern hydrographic survey data that the accuracy of the southern coastal features exceeded what could be achieved by any surveying method available in 1513 AD. The methodological framework for evaluating the Piri Reis Antarctic claim requires careful attention to what is actually being asserted and what the cartographic evidence shows. The claim is not that Piri Reis himself possessed knowledge of Antarctic geography, but rather that the source maps he compiled from included materials based on surveys conducted during a period when the Antarctic coastline was accessible, meaning before the formation of the current ice sheet brought Antarctic temperatures to the levels that have maintained continuous glaciation since approximately 6000 BC. Charles Hapgood of Keene State College, whose 1966 study Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Evidence of advanced civilization in the Ice Age remains the most systematic scholarly analysis of the Piri Reis maps. Antarctic features employed a rigorous cartographic methodology that mapped the Piri Reis southern coastline onto a modern projection of the Antarctic continental shelf using a series of control points identified through comparison of distinctive coastal features. His analysis, which was reviewed and broadly endorsed by the Cartographic Department of the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command in correspondence, made public with Hapgood's study, concluded that the southern coastline depicted on the Piri Reis map corresponds to the Antarctic coast between approximately 20 degrees west longitude and the Palmer Peninsula, with an accuracy inconsistent with speculation or artistic invention and consistent with actual survey data. The longitude accuracy of the Piri Reis map across its entire extent provides a separate analytical dimension that reinforces the anomalous source material hypothesis. Accurate determination of longitude at sea requires either a precise mechanical timekeeper that can maintain Greenwich time accurately across weeks of ocean voyaging, technology not available until the development of the marine chronometer by John Harrison in 1761, or an equivalent method for establishing a common time reference across widely separated observation points. The Piri Reis map shows the Atlantic coasts of Europe, Africa, and South America with longitude relationships accurate to within approximately 1 degree of arc across a span of approximately 120 degrees of longitude, precision that would be impossible to achieve through the dead reckoning and celestial latitude observation that constituted the navigational toolkit available to Portuguese and Spanish explorers in 1513 AD. Cartographic historian Gregory McIntosh of the University of Minnesota, in his 2001 study The Piri Reis Map of 1513, acknowledged the longitude accuracy anomaly as a genuine cartographic puzzle while declining to endorse Hapgood's explanation for it, noting that no conventional explanation for how source materials of the required accuracy could have been compiled using known ancient or medieval navigational techniques has been successfully established. The phenomenon of axial precession, the slow gyroscopic wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the celestial pole to trace a circle through the northern sky over a period of approximately 25,920 years, requires a minimum of several centuries of continuous precise astronomical observation to detect and several additional centuries of mathematical analysis to quantify accurately. Representing one of the most demanding intellectual achievements in the history of astronomy, its conventional attribution to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus of Nicaea around 127 BC, based on his comparison of star positions in his own observations with those recorded by earlier astronomers, is contradicted by evidence that the mathematical value of the precessional cycle was not only known but systematically encoded in the number system's architectural proportions. And mythological narratives of civilizations predating Hipparchus by thousands of years. The fundamental Sumerian unit of the Sar, equivalent to 3,600 years when multiplied by 72, the number of years required for the precessional point to move 1 degree through the zodiac yields exactly 259,200, or 10 complete precessional cycles. This mathematical relationship, documented in the work of scholars Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von der Schend in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, an essay investigating the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through myth, appears to be deliberately embedded in Sumerian numerical systems and demonstrates that the Sumerians were working with processional mathematics at a level of precision that Hipparchus supposedly achieved for the first time more than 2,000 years later. The encoding of processional knowledge in ancient mythological traditions represents the central thesis of de Santillana and von Deschen's Hamlet's Mill, and their documentation of this encoding across dozens of independent cultural traditions constitutes one of the most substantial bodies of evidence for the existence of a sophisticated astronomical knowledge tradition predating known civilization. The analytical method they employed involved identifying recurring numerical values and celestial imagery in mythological texts from cultures worldwide, and demonstrating that these values and images consistently encode the same astronomical constants associated with precession. The number 72, representing the number of years required for 1 degree of precessional advance, appears in mythological contexts across Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Hindu, Norse, and Central American traditions, in ways that de Santillana and von Deschen documented cannot be accounted for by coincidental independent selection of this number for other cultural purposes. In the Egyptian tradition, the myth of Osiris specifies that 72 conspirators assisted Set in the murder of Osiris, a detail that serves no narrative purpose in the myth, but that encodes the precessional rate in a form embedded within a widely transmitted story. The Norse tradition specifies that Valhalla contains 540 doors, through each of which 800 warriors will march at Ragnarok, a detail that yields the product 432,000 when the two numbers are multiplied, encoding the fundamental precessional constant identified by de Santillana and von Deschen in Sumerian, Hindu, and Mayan chronological systems. The architectural encoding of precessional knowledge at Angkor Wat in Cambodia has been documented by Eleanor Manicka of the University of Michigan, whose 1996 study Angkor Wat, Time, Space, and Kingship established through systematic measurement of the temple complex's principal dimensions that the architects incorporated precessional constants into the structure's proportional system with a precision that required advanced knowledge of the precessional cycle's mathematical value. The causeway leading from the western entrance of Angkor Wat to the central tower measures 1,728 Khmer hat in the measurement system Manicka established from internal dimensional analysis of the complex, a distance encoding the number 1,728, which is 4 times 432, and corresponds to one of the fundamental cycle lengths of the Hindu Yuga system that de Santillana and von Deschen demonstrated, encodes the precessional period in multiples. The total east-west axis of the complex encodes the number 2,160 in the same measurement system, corresponding to the duration in years of one precessional age defined as 1/12 of the complete precessional cycle, the same subdivision that the Sumerians employed in their astronomical texts when dividing the zodiacal circle into 12 equal sections. The convergence of these precessional constants in the architectural proportions of a 12th century Cambodian temple, using the same numerical values that appear in Sumerian astronomical texts, Egyptian mythological narratives, and Norse cosmological descriptions, argues for a global tradition of precessional knowledge transmission whose origins predate all the civilizations that preserved it. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2560 BC according to conventional Egyptological chronology, encodes within its fundamental architectural proportions a series of mathematical and astronomical relationships whose precision demands either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate design based on advanced knowledge of geodesy, mathematics, and celestial mechanics. Robert Bauval, a construction engineer and Egyptologist whose 1993 paper in the journal Discussions in Egyptology introduced what became known as the Orion correlation theory, demonstrated through systematic astronomical analysis that the relative positions of the 3 main Giza pyramids on the ground correspond with remarkable precision to the arrangement of the 3 belt stars of the constellation Orion, as they appeared in the southern sky during the period around 10,500 BC, a date determined by the precessional position of those stars at a specific meridian altitude rather than their positions at the conventionally accepted construction date. The Great Pyramid's base perimeter of 921.45 meters, when divided by its original height of 146.59 meters, yields a value of 2 times p accurate to 4 decimal places, a mathematical relationship that requires knowledge of pi to a precision that conventional history attributes to Greek mathematics of the 3rd century BC. More significantly, the ratio of the pyramid's base perimeter to its height, when multiplied by 43,200, the number corresponding to 1/6 of the precessional cycle, yields the polar radius of Earth to within 0.1%, a correspondence that geographer and author Graham Hancock, in his systematic analysis of pyramid geometry, published in Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, argues cannot be accounted for by coincidence given the precision required. The internal architecture of the Great Pyramid provides additional dimensions of encoded astronomical knowledge that Beauval and his collaborators explored in their subsequent work. The 4 narrow shafts that extend from the King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber at precisely calculated angles through the pyramid's internal masonry are not structural features and serve no ventilation function that could not have been. Achieved more simply, indicating that their true purpose was astronomical. Engineer and archaeoastronomer Kate Spence of Cambridge University published an analysis in the journal Nature in 2000 that demonstrated the shafts from the King's Chamber are oriented to align with the transit of specific stars across the meridian at the pyramid's latitude during the epoch of construction, specifically the southern shaft with the belt stars of Orion and the northern shaft with the circumpolar star Thuban, which served as the pole star during the Old Kingdom period due to the precession of Earth's axis, away from its current orientation toward Polaris. The angular precision of these shaft alignments, measured by robotic survey equipment deployed by Rudolf Gantenbrink of the German Institute of Archaeology in 1993, is sufficient to serve as a reliable astronomical instrument for determining the transit times of the target stars, indicating that the pyramid's designers had both the astronomical knowledge to identify the correct shaft angles for these alignments and the construction capability to implement them to the required precision across shaft lengths of up to 65 meters through solid masonry. The geodetic encoding within the Great Pyramid's dimensions extends beyond the polar radius relationship to encompass a comprehensive model of Earth's shape and dimensions that would require survey data of global scope to compile. The pyramid's base dimensions, when corrected for the slight difference between the north-south and east-west base lengths that results from the pyramid's position on a curved planetary surface, encode the relationship between the equatorial and polar radii of Earth with an accuracy that reflects knowledge of Earth's oblate spheroid shape, a geometric property that was not formally recognized in Western science until Isaac Newton's theoretical prediction of equatorial bulging due to Earth's rotation was confirmed by geodetic surveys in the 18th century. The precision of this encoding, which requires knowledge of both the equatorial and polar radii of Earth to an accuracy of better than 1%, implies that the pyramid's designers had access to a planetary geodetic dataset compiled through measurements at multiple latitudes across a substantial portion of Earth's surface. No ancient civilization is credited with conducting surveys of this geographical scope, but the mathematical evidence encoded in the pyramid's dimensions indicates that whoever designed the structure was working with precisely this kind of global geodetic information. The systematic investigation of continental shelf areas submerged by rising sea levels following the end of the last glacial maximum represents one of the most consistently underfinanced and methodologically underserved research programs in contemporary archaeology. Despite the straightforward fact that sea level rises of between 100 and 140 meters since approximately 20,000 years ago have inundated an area of formerly dry land approximately equal to the current combined landmass of South America and Antarctica, eliminating whatever archaeological record existed on those submerged plains as permanently as if it had been deliberately destroyed. The implications of this submergence for understanding the full range of early human civilization are rarely confronted directly in mainstream academic discourse, but the mathematics are unambiguous. If human populations inhabited coastal zones during the last glacial maximum at anything approaching the density documented for post-glacial coastal settlement, then the majority of early human settlement sites now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water. Marine archaeologist Glenn Milne of the University of Ottawa, whose computational modelling of post-glacial sea level changes has provided the most detailed reconstruction yet available of the sequence and rate of continental shelf inundation, has identified several regions where the rate of sea level rise would have been catastrophically rapid from a human perspective, including the Persian Gulf Basin, which was fully exposed dry land until approximately 8000 BC and then flooded completely within approximately 2000 years as the Strait of Hormuz opened to allow Indian Ocean waters to fill the basin from its eastern end. The ancient city of Dwarka, described in the Mahabharata as Krishna's capital city located on the western coast of India and submerged beneath the sea following a catastrophic inundation, has been located through marine archaeological surveys conducted by the National Institute of Oceanography of India beginning in the 1980s. With the most comprehensive surveys conducted between 1988 and 2003, revealing massive stone structures at depths of up to 40 metres, covering an area of several square kilometres that includes walls, gateways, and harbour facilities constructed from precisely fitted megalithic blocks. The marine archaeological surveys at Dwarka, conducted by S.R. Howe of the National Institute of Oceanography, represent the most extensively documented underwater excavation of a major ancient site in the Indian subcontinent, and the physical evidence they recovered corresponds to the Mahabharata's descriptions of the city, with a specificity that conventional archaeology has been reluctant to engage directly. The survey teams, operating from research vessels and using scuba equipment supported by underwater cameras and sampling tools, documented a site extending over an area of approximately 5 square kilometres on the seabed, at depths ranging from 5 to 40 metres off the coast of the modern town of Dwarka in Gujarat. The structures identified include a series of massive stone walls constructed from rectangular sandstone blocks, averaging approximately 1.5 metres in length and weighing between 1 and 5 tons, fitted together in courses without mortar, using a precision jointing technique that matches the construction characteristics documented at pre-Harappan and early Harappan period sites on the subcontinent. Carbon dating of wood samples recovered from within the structure fills by the survey team yielded dates clustering around 7,500 to 8,000 years BP, placing the construction of the Dwarka structures significantly earlier than the conventionally accepted timeline of urban development in the Indian subcontinent, and within the period when the continental shelf at Dwarka's location would have been undergoing active submergence due to post-glacial sea level rise. The harbour facilities identified in the Dwarka survey provide particularly compelling evidence of the site's sophisticated urban character. The survey team documented what appear to be 3 distinct harbour basins defined by stone jetty structures, extending from the submerged shoreline, with channel configurations indicating deliberate design for the management of vessel traffic and protection from prevailing wave action. Underwater photography of the jetty structures shows stone construction, using interlocking blocks fitted with the same precision as the wall sections, and bathymetric survey of the harbour basins indicates water depths within the basins that would have been appropriate for the draft of large cargo vessels at the time of the site's construction, suggesting deliberate dredging or selection of natural depth sufficient for maritime commerce. The scale of the harbour facilities, capable of accommodating dozens of vessels simultaneously based on the basin dimensions documented in the survey reports, implies that Dwarka functioned as a major maritime trade centre, whose commercial reach extended well beyond the immediate coastal region, consistent with the Mahabharata's description of the city as a hub of sea trade connecting the Indian subcontinent with the wider ancient world. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan provides a second major underwater site, whose characteristics have generated sustained controversy between researchers arguing for natural geological formation and those identifying the features as products of human construction. The monument, first documented by sport diver Kihachiro Aratake in 1986 and subsequently surveyed by Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, consists of a series of stepped terraces, flat platforms, and angular formations cut into solid sandstone at depths ranging from 5 to 25 metres below current sea level off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan's Ryukyu chain. Kimura's systematic survey, published in the journal Marine Geology in 2002, identified features including right-angle corners maintained across spans of several metres, parallel walls with consistent spacing, what appear to be staircases with uniform tread and riser dimensions, and circular depressions that Kimura interpreted as ceremonial pools, all carved from the same continuous sandstone formation. Geological analysis of the site by Robert Schoch of Boston University, who dived the monument and published his assessment in the journal Anthropology in 2002, concluded that while some features could be attributed to natural fracturing along the sandstone's joint planes, others, including the right-angle corners, the staircase features, and the circular depressions, were inconsistent with any natural geological process he could identify, and most plausibly resulted from human modification of a natural rock surface. The monument's depth places its surface above sea level during the period of lowered glacial sea levels between approximately 10,000 and 13,000 years ago, providing a construction window consistent with the occupation of the East Asian continental shelf by human populations during the late Pleistocene. The Sunda Shelf, the exposed continental shelf that connected the Indonesian archipelago to mainland Southeast Asia during the glacial maximum and constituted a landmass of approximately 1.8 million square kilometers, supporting major river systems and diverse ecosystems, represents the most significant single area of submerged potential civilization in the world. And its systematic archaeological investigation has barely begun, despite the straightforward availability of marine survey technologies that have successfully identified structures at Dwarka and Yonaguni. Geologist Robert Menzies of Duke University, in his pioneering survey of Southeast Asian continental shelf, bathymetry published in 1968, identified submerged river valleys and coastal plain formations on the Sunda Shelf consistent with the geomorphology expected of a formerly exposed landmass supporting large river drainage systems, and estimated that the shelf's submergence over the period from 20,000 to 6,000 years ago would have displaced coastal populations numbering in the millions from territories that had supported human habitation for tens of thousands of years. The cultural memory of this displacement, preserved in flood traditions across Southeast Asian and oceanic cultures that consistently describe the loss of a great land beneath rising waters, may represent the most direct oral historical record of the post-glacial sea level rise available in any human tradition. The Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, whose name derives from its opening words meaning "when on high," survives in multiple cuneiform copies recovered primarily from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and from excavations at Ashur and Kish. With the most complete version consisting of 7 tablets, totaling approximately 1,100 lines of Akkadian verse that scholars have generally agreed draws from Sumerian originals, predating the earliest surviving copies by at least a millennium. The text presents a cosmological narrative that describes the formation of the present world order through the defeat of primordial cosmic forces by the god Marduk, who then uses the body of the defeated chaos deity Tiamat to construct heaven and earth, establishes the movements of the stars and planets, and creates humanity from the blood of the rebel god King mixed with clay. This narrative, read as theological mythology by conventional scholarship, has been subjected to alternative analysis by researchers including Zechariah Sitchin, whose work, despite its controversial reception in academic circles, drew attention to specific astronomical language within the text that describes planetary orbital dynamics with a precision that conventional mythology does not require or explain. The Enuma Elish's description of Marduk's approach from the outer solar system, his disruption of existing planetary orbits through gravitational interaction, and the subsequent rearrangement of the inner solar system employs technical terminology for orbital mechanics that appears throughout Babylonian astronomical texts in non-mythological contexts, suggesting that the narrative framework of the creation epic may encode genuine astronomical information about solar system history in a form designed to ensure its survival through oral transmission across multiple generations. The specific astronomical terminology employed in the Enuma Elish warrants detailed examination because its technical precision exceeds what is required by the narrative function of the text in ways that are analytically significant. The description of Marduk's approach toward the inner solar system uses the Akkadian term Nudiim Mud for his trajectory, a term that in Babylonian astronomical texts designating actual planetary observations refers specifically to the path followed by a body moving in an inclined orbit relative to the ecliptic plane. The application of this orbital mechanics terminology to a narrative description of a divine being's cosmic approach indicates that the text's composers were working within an astronomical, conceptual framework sophisticated enough to distinguish between objects moving in the ecliptic plane and those approaching at angles to it, a distinction that in modern celestial mechanics corresponds to the concept of orbital inclination. The Enuma Elisha's account of Tiamat's fragmentation through Marduk's assault, and the subsequent formation of Earth and the asteroid belt from her divided body employs language that corresponds technically to the process of planetary formation through accretion and disruption, in ways that, if taken as an astronomical description rather than a theological metaphor, describe the formation of the inner solar system with a structural accuracy that modern planetary science has confirmed represents the actual sequence of events during solar system formation. The numerical structure of the Enuma Elish provides additional evidence for astronomical encoding within the text's narrative framework. The epic consists of 7 tablets, a number that corresponds to the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye in antiquity, namely the Sun, Moon, and 5 planets from Mercury through Saturn. And the assignment of 1 tablet to each of these celestial objects in the narrative sequence mirrors the organizational structure of Babylonian astronomical compendia that assign specific tablets within a series to each of the 7 heavenly bodies. The epic's description of Marduk establishing the stations of the great gods by assigning specific stellar positions to each deity corresponds precisely to the organizational logic of the 3 celestial pathways in the Mul.Apin compendium, suggesting that the Enuma Elish and the astronomical compendia are parallel encodings of the same underlying celestial knowledge tradition in 2 different literary formats, one designed for institutional transmission through scribal education, and the other designed for broader cultural transmission through narrative performance. This parallel encoding strategy, using both technical reference formats and mythological narrative to preserve the same information, is precisely what would be expected of a knowledge preservation system designed to survive across political disruptions that might destroy either the scribal institutions or the narrative traditions while leaving the other intact. The mystery schools of the ancient world, operating from the earliest documented period of Mesopotamian temple culture through the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, and continuing in various forms through the medieval period and into modernity, represent a category of institution whose fundamental purpose, conventional scholarship, has consistently underestimated by focusing on their religious and philosophical dimensions, while neglecting their function as repositories and transmission systems for advanced technical knowledge. The temple schools of ancient Egypt, operating within complexes like the Temple of Ptah at Memphis and the institution known as the House of Life that appears in administrative records from multiple sites across dynastic Egyptian history, preserved and transmitted knowledge in medicine, mathematics, astronomy and engineering through controlled initiation processes that restricted access to verified individuals while ensuring continuity of transmission across political disruptions, dynastic changes and cultural transformations. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt during the period from 237 to 57 BC, but explicitly described in their own text as copies of much older documents, describe a category of ancient records called the Builder texts that contain the original plans for sacred architecture and the astronomical knowledge used to orient and proportion temples correctly. These texts, analysed in detail by Egyptologist Raymond in her 1969 study The Mythological Origin of the Egyptian Temple, describe how the plans for sacred buildings were preserved from a time before the current world order, brought through a catastrophic flood by divine beings called the Followers of Horus, and deposited in underground repositories at sacred sites that had been identified and marked before the catastrophe occurred. The operational structure of the Egyptian House of Life, documented in administrative papyri from multiple dynastic periods and analysed in detail by John Baines of Oxford University in his 1990 study Restricted Knowledge, Hierarchy and Decorum in Ancient Egypt, reveals an institution with a far more sophisticated knowledge management system than the term school implies. The House of Life functioned as a scriptorium, a library, a medical training centre, and a research institution simultaneously, with different categories of knowledge restricted to initiates who had completed different levels of training and demonstrated both intellectual competency and personal reliability as assessed through extended periods of supervised study and service. The most sensitive categories of knowledge, designated in administrative records by the phrase "that which is secret or hidden things," were accessible only to the highest grade of initiates, and were stored in sections of the institution's physical archive that required specific authorization for access. The content of these restricted categories, inferred from references in texts that describe what the highest initiates knew without revealing its specific content, included what the texts call the secret of the sky, the secret of the earth, and the secret of the primordial time, designations that in the context of the institution's documented knowledge domains correspond to advanced astronomical knowledge, geological and geographical information of unusual scope, and historical records extending back before the conventional beginning of Egyptian civilization. The Pythagorean schools of ancient Greece provide a well-documented example of the mystery school tradition, operating in a context where sufficient historical evidence survives to analyze the knowledge transmission system in detail. The community founded by Pythagoras of Samos at Croton in southern Italy around 530 BC combined mathematical instruction with strict ethical requirements and a graduated initiation system that restricted access to the most advanced mathematical knowledge to members who had demonstrated commitment through extended periods of preliminary study. The mathematical content associated with the most advanced levels of Pythagorean teaching, reconstructed from references in later classical sources, including Iamblichus of Chalcis, whose 4th century AD Life of Pythagoras preserves detailed accounts of the school's curriculum, included knowledge of irrational numbers, infinite series, and the mathematical relationships governing musical intervals and planetary orbital periods that, in the conventional history of mathematics, should not have been available to a 6th century BC Greek philosopher without a documented source. Pythagoras himself is consistently described in ancient sources as having travelled to Egypt and Babylon before establishing his school, spending decades studying under the initiated teachers of Egyptian and Babylonian temple institutions, before returning to Greece with the mathematical knowledge that became the foundation of his teaching. The connection between the Pythagorean mathematical tradition and the temple school systems of Egypt and Mesopotamia is not speculative, but is explicitly attested in the ancient biographical sources, indicating direct transmission of advanced mathematical knowledge from the older institutional systems to the emerging Greek philosophical tradition. The systematic comparative analysis of terminology related to divine beings, astronomical phenomena, and advanced technical knowledge across the ancient languages of Sumerian, Egyptian hieroglyphic, and Sanskrit reveals patterns of correspondence that conventional historical linguistics, which does not recognize any genetic relationship between these language families, struggles to accommodate within its standard frameworks. These correspondences extend beyond the superficial level of similar-sounding words with related meanings, which can always be attributed to coincidence or sound symbolism, to encompass shared technical terminology for sophisticated concepts whose elaboration in multiple independent language traditions argues for transmission from a common source, rather than parallel invention. The Sumerian word mi, designating the complete set of divine principles governing all institutions of civilization, and used in the earliest cuneiform texts to describe what the Apkallu transmitted to human rulers, has a structural and functional parallel in the Sanskrit word rta, designating the cosmic order underlying all natural and social phenomena, and in the Egyptian concept of ma'at, the principle of cosmic truth and order whose maintenance was the central obligation of the pharaoh. These three terms are not phonetically related, which rules out simple borrowing, but their functional equivalents across three unrelated linguistic traditions, each describing a totality of governing principles transmitted from divine sources to human institutions in the earliest phase of civilization, suggest derivation from a common conceptual framework that preceded the separation of these language communities. Linguist Dr. Edo Nyland, in a systematic analysis of early linguistic traditions published in 2001, documented over 500 cases of terminological correspondence between Sumerian administrative vocabulary and Sanskrit technical terms that could not be accounted for by known patterns of language contact, suggesting the possibility of a proto-language or knowledge transmission system operating before the documented divergence of these linguistic traditions. The terminological convergences between ancient languages extend into the specific vocabulary used to describe divine beings and their interactions with human civilization in ways that carry technical rather than merely conceptual content. The Sumerian designation for the divine assembly, the Anunnaki, meaning literally those who came from heaven to earth, has a structural parallel in the Sanskrit term Anunnaki appearing in Vedic texts to designate a category of celestial beings who descended to interact with human communities, a correspondence that conventional historical linguistics cannot explain through known patterns of borrowing between these language traditions, since no documented contact between Sumerian and Vedic cultural communities has been established for the period when these terminological usages are attested in both traditions. The Egyptian designation for the primordial divine teachers, the Neteru, whose individual names include Ptah, the creator and artificer, and Thoth, the master of wisdom and writing, has functional and in some cases phonological parallels in the Sumerian tradition that are specific enough to suggest derivation from a common source vocabulary rather than independent terminological invention. Egyptologist and linguist Lorraine Evans, in her 2001 study Kingdom of the Ark, documented phonological correspondences between Egyptian and Sanskrit, royal and religious vocabulary that she argued indicated direct cultural contact between ancient Egypt and the Vedic tradition at a period significantly earlier than conventional archaeology places significant interaction between these civilizations. The astronomical vocabulary shared across these three ancient language traditions provides the most analytically tractable category of cross-linguistic correspondence, because astronomical phenomena provide an objective referent against which the precision of terminological descriptions can be evaluated. The Sumerian term for the precessional cycle, expressed through the mathematical relationships in the Sar-based numerical system, has a direct conceptual parallel in the Sanskrit Yuga system's mathematical encoding of precessional periods, and both systems encode the same fundamental precessional constant of 25,920 years through different but mathematically equivalent approaches. The Egyptian astronomical vocabulary for describing stellar precession, reconstructed from the pyramid texts and the astronomical ceilings of New Kingdom tombs by astronomer and Egyptologist Jane Sellers in her 1992 study The Death of Gods in Ancient Egypt, employs numerical relationships and celestial imagery that correspond precisely to those identified by de Santillana and von der Chende in their analysis of Sumerian and Hindu precessional encoding. The convergence of these three independent astronomical traditions on the same mathematical description of the same astronomical phenomenon, expressed through linguistically unrelated but functionally equivalent terminological systems, argues for derivation from a common astronomical knowledge source whose geographical and temporal origins predate the separation of the Sumerian, Egyptian, and Sanskrit cultural traditions. The cumulative weight of evidence examined across the domains surveyed in this investigation, spanning the anomalous architectural sophistication of Eridu's 17 building levels, the precisely encoded astronomical mathematics of the Sumerian king list, the specific technical details shared across 500 independent flood traditions, the engineering capabilities demonstrated at Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, the impossible precision of the Antikythera mechanism, the subglacial Antarctic features depicted on the Piri Reis map, and the systematic institutional preservation of advanced knowledge through mystery schools maintained across millennia, converges toward a conclusion that mainstream archaeology has been structurally reluctant to confront. The conventional model of human technological development as a continuous linear progression from primitive to sophisticated, interrupted only by the natural processes of cultural diffusion and independent invention, is inadequate to explain the physical and textual record that systematic investigation actually reveals. The Cuneiform tablets that preserve the Sumerian accounts of the Apkallu are not describing religious mythology in the sense that modern Western culture uses that term. They are recording, in the administrative and chronicle formats appropriate to their institutional context, a set of historical claims about the origins of Sumerian civilization's foundational knowledge that Sumerian scribes themselves distinguished from mythological narrative using technical terminology, administrative catalogue formats, and specific institutional attributions that in every other context within the cuneiform corpus indicate the recording of factual historical information. The tablet designated CBS 10,673 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, part of the late Nippur archive that documents what its own text calls the Great Withdrawal of the Divine Council, states in matter-of-fact administrative language that the assembled Anunnaki determined their earthly mission had reached completion, employing the same bureaucratic phrasing found in Sumerian records of the termination of trade agreements and the closure of royal construction projects, suggesting that whoever composed this text understood the Anunnaki withdrawal not as a mythological event in an eternal sacred narrative, but as a historical occurrence within administrable time. The pattern that emerges from systematic examination of the physical and textual evidence across these domains is not the pattern predicted by conventional developmental models, and is not consistent with the hypothesis that Sumerian civilization and its contemporaries achieved their documented capabilities through the internal developmental processes of historical human communities working within the constraints of natural cognitive and organizational evolution. The pattern that actually emerges from this evidence is the pattern of inheritance. At every site where the archaeological record preserves the earliest recoverable occupation levels, the technical knowledge of those earliest inhabitants already reflects mastery of principles whose derivation through local experimentation is not supported by any developmental evidence in the stratigraphic sequence. At every major ancient text repository where antediluvian source claims are preserved, the astronomical, mathematical, and technical content of those claimed antediluvian sources demonstrates knowledge whose precision and sophistication exceeds what the receiving civilization could have generated independently within its documented history. And across every domain of cross-cultural comparison, whether flood narratives, architectural proportional systems, astronomical numerical constants, or divine being terminologies, the specific technical details that carry the most analytical weight show a consistency across independent traditions that the framework of independent invention cannot accommodate without multiplying improbable coincidences to a degree that constitutes its own refutation. The Sumerian tablets are telling us, in language whose administrative precision leaves little room for interpretive ambiguity, that the knowledge founding their civilization was given rather than discovered, transmitted from beings who possessed it before the flood rather than developed by the communities who inherited it afterward. The archaeological record at Eridu, Uruk, and across the network of early Mesopotamian sites confirms that this is precisely what the physical evidence shows. A civilizational knowledge base that appears in its earliest recoverable form already complete, already sophisticated, already encoding mathematical and astronomical relationships that took the civilization inheriting them millennia to partially understand. The flood traditions worldwide confirm that a catastrophic event of genuine global scope preceded this transmission, eliminating a previous phase of human development whose physical remains now lie beneath the continental shelves that were inundated as the Ice Age ended. The mystery schools and institutional knowledge preservation systems confirm that the transmission was understood by those who participated in it as the deliberate conservation of a prior civilization's achievements, carried through catastrophe by beings whose capabilities exceeded those of the communities they were guiding. What remains for contemporary scholarship is not a methodological question about whether to take this evidence seriously, but a conceptual question about what framework is adequate to accommodate what the evidence actually demonstrates about the depth, sophistication, and ultimate origins of the civilization that first looked up at the temples of Sumer and understood, even if imperfectly, that what they had inherited was older than anything their records could name. The investigation that began in the deepest excavation trench at Eridu, beneath 17 layers of temple construction that arrived complete rather than evolved, has led through a body of evidence whose cumulative implications can no longer be absorbed within the conventional framework of human prehistory without fundamentally revising that framework's foundational assumptions. The Sumerian temples, the Apkallu tablets, the mathematically encoded king list, the precision hydraulics of Telisawan, the astronomical sophistication of the Mul.Apin compendium, the engineering anomalies at Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, the electrochemical knowledge preserved in the Baghdad batteries, the Antarctic geography encoded in a 1513 map compiled from sources its own author described as ancient, the processional mathematics embedded in monuments from Mesopotamia to Cambodia, the flood traditions sharing technical specifications across 500 independent cultures, the Younger Dryas impact evidence confirming that a global catastrophe of the required magnitude actually occurred, and the institutional knowledge preservation systems of the mystery schools that carried advanced information across millennia of political disruption. These are not isolated anomalies that can be individually explained away through appeals to coincidence, misidentification, or methodological error. They are a coherent and mutually reinforcing body of evidence pointing in the same direction, with a consistency that demands a coherent explanation rather than piecemeal dismissal. That explanation, preserved with remarkable consistency in the oldest administrative and literary records of the earliest human civilizations, is that the knowledge founding those civilizations was transmitted from an antecedent source of greater sophistication that was itself destroyed in the catastrophic events marking the boundary between the last ice age and the current interglacial period. The Sumerians called the transmitters of this knowledge the Apkallu. The Egyptians called them the followers of Horus and the Neteru. The Hebrew tradition called them the Watchers. The Hindu tradition called them the Devas who preceded the current age of humanity. Different names, different cultural frameworks, different narrative elaborations surrounding a core historical claim that is consistent across all of them. Advanced beings possessed of knowledge beyond the capacity of contemporary human civilization transmitted that knowledge to the communities that survived the Great Catastrophe, establishing the institutional, architectural, and intellectual foundations that enabled the apparently sudden emergence of sophisticated civilization at multiple locations across the ancient world. The significance of this conclusion for contemporary humanity extends beyond academic archaeology into the domain of civilizational self-understanding. We are not, as the conventional narrative of human progress assumes, the apex of a continuous ascent from primitive beginnings. We are, by the weight of the evidence this investigation has assembled, the inheritors of a tradition far older and more sophisticated than our recorded history acknowledges, working with fragments of knowledge whose original coherence we have only partially reconstructed, building toward capabilities that previous iterations of human civilization reached before catastrophe reset the cycle. The mystery schools that preserved what survived of the previous civilization's knowledge understood this explicitly, and the encoded warnings they embedded in architectural monuments, mythological narratives, and astronomical calculations were not addressed to their own generation, but to a future one advanced enough to decode them. That future is now the present. The tools of modern archaeology, astronomy, genetics, geology, and computational analysis have placed us in a position to read the evidence that previous generations could only partially interpret, and what that evidence reads is an instruction and a warning simultaneously. The instruction is that the knowledge we have spent recorded history laboriously reconstructing was already known, already applied, already lost once, and can be lost again. The warning is that the catastrophic mechanisms responsible for the previous loss, cosmic impact events, rapid climate transitions, and the civilizational vulnerabilities that accumulate when technological capability outpaces the wisdom to manage it, remain active features of the planetary and social environment we inhabit. The earliest temples of Sumer were not the beginning of human civilization. They were its recommencement, built by people who knew they were inheriting something they had not created, and who devoted their greatest institutional energies to ensuring that what had been given to them would survive to be given again.